The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we go further, if you want extended lore, cutscenes, and members-only timelines that never make it to YouTube, the link to our Patreon is in the description. Every compartment on the Hogwarts Express had been claimed by 11 o'clock, every seat occupied, every trunk wrestled into an overhead rack by some combination of magic and stubbornness. Chocolate frogs were already changing hands. Someone's owl was objecting loudly to the motion of the train. The corridors smelled of pasties and pumpkin juice, and the particular anticipatory nervousness of children standing on the edge of something they cannot yet name. 2 seats, in a compartment near the middle of the train, were empty. No one asked why. This was, in itself, unusual. First years are territorial about compartment space with the ferocity of small animals. But the thought of asking never quite arrived. The empty seats registered as correct, a gap in the pattern that the mind smoothed over without examination. The door to the compartment was closed. No one tried to open it. The train ran through the Scottish countryside as the light went gold and then gray. The Great Hall, Hogwarts. 7:52 p.m. The castle announced itself from across the lake the way it always had. Enormous, improbable, lit from within by something that was not quite fire and not quite light, and had never been formally categorized. The first years in the boats made the sounds first years always made, the breathless pause, the murmured "oh," the stiffening of small bodies encountering something too large for immediate understanding. The water was black under the early evening sky. The boats moved without oars. Ronald Weasley sat in the third boat from the left and tried to look like he wasn't impressed, because he had been told about this, and being told about something means you shouldn't be surprised when it happens. He was, very much, surprised. He also noticed, with the particular social attentiveness of a boy who has 6 siblings and has therefore learned to read a room as a survival skill, that 2 of the boats were moving with no passengers in them. He did not mention this. He could not have explained why. The sorting had been underway for 9 minutes when the torches went out. Not dimmed, not flickered in a draft, out. Every torch in the Great Hall extinguished simultaneously, as if the air itself had decided to stop cooperating. The hall went dark. The enchanted ceiling, its stars suddenly very close, offered no comment. Then the torches returned. In the center of the hall, between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables, stood Harry Potter and Hermione Granger. They had not walked in. There was no door behind them. They were simply there. The way a stone is there at the bottom of a river, present, permanent, uninterested in the question of how they came to be where they were. They were dressed in school robes that fit correctly in the way that things fit when they have not been measured but have simply arrived in the right form. They were 11 years old. They stood with a stillness that had no performance in it, not the stillness of a child trying to appear calm, but the stillness of something that is calm the way deep water is calm, because nothing that moves on the surface quite reaches it. The hall did not breathe. Professor McGonagall's parchment did not shake in her hands. This was objectively remarkable. She said, "Potter, Harry." Harry walked to the stool. He sat. His face was turned slightly toward the head table, and Albus Dumbledore, who had in the course of his long life received perhaps 4 or 5 genuinely novel experiences, felt something he had not felt in decades, the specific quality of being seen, not observed, not assessed, seen, as if the boy's gaze moved through the half-moon spectacles, through the careful smile, through the decades of curated wisdom, and located without difficulty the thing underneath all of it that Dumbledore had spent most of his adult life not looking at directly. He set his goblet down with very great care. McGonagall lowered the sorting hat toward Harry's head. The hat did not touch him. It recoiled. Not away, inward, bunching on itself like a hand closing into a fist, and then, in a voice that the sorting hat had not used in over 1,000 years of continuous service, "They are already climbed." The sound bounced off the stone walls and the enchanted ceiling, and the faces of 400 students who had been expecting either Gryffindor or possibly Slytherin and had received nothing that was on the available list. Several ghosts drifted through the far wall to investigate the commotion, and then drifted back out again without explanation. McGonagall breathed once, carefully, through her nose. "Granger, Hermione," she said. She extended the hat toward Hermione. The hat did not move. It said, from Professor McGonagall's hands, in a voice that was quieter than the scream but no less absolute, "No." Hermione stood where she stood. If this affected her, it was not visible. She had very dark eyes, and they were fixed on the middle distance, on nothing, on the specific quality of attention a person pays when they are listening to a conversation conducting itself in a language no one else in the room can hear. The head table convened the way faculty councils convene when the agenda has been overturned, urgently, quietly, entirely without words. Whatever was communicated moved through the expressions and the held glances of 6 professors in the space of 3 minutes. Dumbledore's face moved through several configurations during this time, each carefully assembled, none of them quite settled. What he could not fully manage was the moment, brief approximately 2 seconds, where it became apparent that he had been expecting something and had received its confirmation, and that the confirmation gave him no relief. He stood, Harry Potter and Hermione Granger, he said, in the voice that he had spent decades calibrating to communicate wisdom and warmth, and the gentle authority of someone who has earned every gray hair, will be joining Gryffindor House as consistent with the hat's intention. A pause so minor that only the most attentive students registered it, expressed in its own fashion this evening. This was a diplomatic fiction, and every person above the age of 14 in the hall knew it. The hall applauded regardless, because the alternative was silence, and silence had already done its work. Harry and Hermione walked to the Gryffindor table. They sat. Percy Weasley found them after the feast. He was 17, a prefect, and he had a prefect's relationship with correct procedure the way certain people have a relationship with weather. It was the organizing principle of his daily experience. He produced his authority the way another person might produce identification, not aggressively, but constantly as evidence of something he needed to keep proving. He explained the points system. He explained the expectations of Gryffindor students. He explained the ways in which new students most commonly created difficulties in their first weeks, and the mechanisms by which those difficulties could be avoided. It was a complete speech. He had given it before. It covered everything. He had been speaking for approximately 90 seconds when Harry looked at him. It was not a complicated look. Harry's face was still, arranged in no particular configuration. He was simply attending, the way something attends when it is not deciding what to do but has already decided long ago, and is simply watching the remaining motion of things play out. Percy Weasley had been looked at many times in his life. He had never been looked at like this. The speech stopped, not because he was interrupted, not because he forgot his place. It stopped the way sound stops when a door closes between you and the room that held it, complete, and from outside the room, total. Percy became aware of the specific dimensions of the corridor, the age of the stone, the way the torchlight did not quite reach the far corners. He became aware, without being able to explain why, that he was a very young man in a very old building, standing in front of something he had no prior data for. He said, "Right, well, yes," and left. He would spend most of the following 2 weeks only partially understanding what had happened to his speech. This was, in fact, more than most people managed. At the far end of the Gryffindor table, Ronald Weasley watched his brother's retreat with the expression of someone filing new information next to existing information and finding the combination extremely interesting. He had been watching the whole evening with the patience of a boy who has learned, through years of large family dinners, that the most useful observations arrive when no one is aware you're making them. He looked at Harry Potter. He looked at Hermione Granger. They were eating very little. They were speaking to each other in a register too low to overhear. They were, side by side, the calmest people in the room. Calm the way the room before a storm is calm, which is a different thing from the calm of the room after one. Everyone around them had spent the last hour being frightened, or awed, or very busy pretending to be neither. Ron was, he found, mostly curious. He had grown up with dragons and gnomes and a clock that tracked his family's proximity to mortal peril as a standard household feature. He was not easily convinced that something was frightening simply because everyone else thought it was. What he was looking at, 2 kids who had appeared from nowhere and made the Sorting Hat have what appeared to be a religious experience, looked, to him, like 2 kids who might not know where the Gryffindor common room was. He thought, "I'm going to talk to them." He wasn't sure yet when, but he was sure. At the head table, Albus Dumbledore had not touched his dessert. He was watching the Gryffindor table. He was watching 2 children who had arrived in his hall without passing through his doors, who had reduced over 1,000 years of magical tradition to 2 words, and who were now sitting and eating bread as if this were an ordinary evening in an ordinary year. He thought about a drawer in his office. He thought about what was folded inside it. He thought about what it meant that the boys' eyes, when they had found him across the table, had moved through everything Dumbledore had built, like light moves through glass. Not stopped, not reflected, simply through. He had been expecting them. He had not been prepared for the very specific certainty, arriving now and settling like cold water, that expecting them and being ready for them were not the same thing at all. He picked up his goblet, set it down again. Outside, the Scottish dark pressed against the castle windows, and the lake lay still below, and somewhere in the deep machinery of Hogwarts the torches burned and the staircases turned, and the building that had stood for 1,000 years went about its old work of keeping itself, as it always had, alive. Nothing felt different about the night. Everything was different about the night. The corridor announced itself on the 2nd of September. It was on the 3rd floor, previously unremarkable, previously used to store the accumulated overflow of 1,000 years of institutional life. Broken chairs, outdated textbooks, several cauldrons that had developed opinions about being cleaned. The morning after the sorting, the storage was gone. No one moved it. The corridor simply no longer contained it the way a room no longer contains a sound once the sound has ended. The tapestries came next. By the 4th of September, the pastoral hunting scenes that had lined the stone walls for 4 decades had been replaced by something else. The new tapestries featured geometries that had no name in any architectural tradition. Dark shapes arranged in patterns that the eye kept trying to resolve into images without ever quite succeeding. They moved, but only at the edges of vision. When you looked directly at them, they were still. 2 doors appeared on the 5th of September. They fit the wall so precisely that they might have been there for centuries. Neither bore a handle, a knocker, or any visible means of entry. Professor Dumbledore walked the corridor once on the morning of the 6th. He stood at its end with his hands folded behind his back and looked at the tapestries for a long time. He said nothing. He walked back the way he came, and in his office that evening he sat for an hour without touching the paperwork on his desk. He had not arranged any of this. The castle had, which meant the castle had made a decision independent of his, which was not something he had previously considered within its capacity. He filed this understanding carefully alongside the other understandings accumulating, since the night of September 1st, into something he was not yet prepared to name. The other Gryffindors did not go to the cold corridor. This was not a rule. No one announced it, posted it, or enforced it. It was simply the case that the warmth of the common room, the particular warmth of 7 centuries of accumulated firelight and shared meals, and the continuous human noise of people living in close proximity, became newly important to them in a way it had never been before. They noticed the fire more. They sat closer to it. They filled the space between themselves with conversation they hadn't known they'd missed. They did not discuss this. There was nothing to discuss. Harry and Hermione did not experience the corridor as cold. This was the precise truth, and it was also a more complicated truth than it appeared. The temperature of the corridor was measurably lower than the rest of the castle. Hermione had confirmed this 3 mornings running with the thermometric charm she had taught herself from a 4th-year text over a single weekend. The cold was real. They simply did not experience it as a problem. Cold was the natural temperature of the void. They had spent years in the void. The corridor was, to them, the closest thing to home that the mortal world had yet offered them. Between them there was a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Nothing built it, nothing maintained it. It required no fuel. It was the warmth of 2 people who had known each other in a place outside of time, before language and before memory, and who had carried that knowledge back across the threshold without needing to discuss it. They ate together. They studied together. When Harry's essays drifted toward imprecision, Hermione's corrections appeared in the margins in her careful script. Not suggestions, not requests. Corrections, and Harry read them and incorporated them without argument, because accuracy was the only standard that mattered, and he could not argue with accuracy. They did not require conversation to fill the space between them. When they spoke, they meant it. When they were silent, the silence was full rather than empty. The difference between a room that is quiet because it has been abandoned and a room that is quiet because something in it is thinking. Ron Weasley spent 3 weeks watching before he did anything about it. He watched at meals, noting that they drank water where every other first year drank pumpkin juice, that they ate with the deliberate focus of people who understood food as information rather than pleasure, that they spoke to each other in a register so low it was less conversation and more the sound a river makes before it goes underground. He watched in classes, where they answered questions with a precision that made Professor McGonagall's eyebrows do complicated things, and did not appear to be trying. He watched in the corridors between lessons, where other students moved around them the way water moves around an obstacle, not reluctantly, not resentfully, simply as a function of the way things were. 3 weeks. He was thorough. He had 6 siblings and a mother who noticed everything. He came by thoroughness, honestly. On the 3rd of October, a Thursday, the tail end of dinner, he filled a plate from the Gryffindor table. He carried it down the cold corridor. He found the door that was clearly Harry's the way that certain things are clearly themselves, without explanation, without evidence, simply through the quality of their presence in a space. He knocked. The door opened. Harry looked at him. Ron, who had once made direct eye contact with an adult spider the size of a Labrador retriever on a dare from Fred, and who had survived 17 years of his mother's organizational certainty, held up the plate. "I brought food," he said. "Figured you might want some." A pause. "Also, I'm Ron Weasley, in case you forgot." Harry was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable moment. It was the quiet of someone considering the information presented rather than the quiet of someone deciding whether to close the door. "We know," Harry said. "Come in." Ron came back the next Thursday, then the Thursday after that, then, with the gradual inevitability of water finding its level, most days. He brought chocolate frogs once, which Harry and Hermione ate with the careful attention of people cataloging data. The chocolate, the spell work required to animate the frog, the historical figures on the collector's cards, which Hermione began organizing by century in a way she never quite acknowledged was more than casual interest. He brought Bertie Bott's every flavor beans as an experiment and watched them work through the entire bag with the methodical focus of researchers. Harry ate the vomit-flavored one without expression. Hermione ate the earwax one, considered it, and said, "It's quite accurate." Ron threw his suspected earwax one directly into the fireplace and decided this was correct. He talked. Ron was structurally a talker. He came from a family where silence meant something was wrong, where the normal register of communication was 3 or 4 conversations occurring simultaneously, and nobody particularly bothered to track which one they were in. He talked about his family, his brothers, the Borough Quidditch statistics that went back 4 decades because his father had kept every profit sports section since 1962. He talked about things that mattered to him and things that didn't, and he had not yet learned to distinguish between these categories as a social calibration. Harry and Hermione listened. Ron had expected, in some unexamined way, to be heard in the way he was usually heard by adults, with the fraction of attention that indicated the listener was waiting for him to finish so they could say something of their own. This was different. This was the complete quality of attention, not performative, not charitable. They listened the way people listen when they have decided that what someone is saying is worth the time. When they spoke, it was precise. Hermione did not fill silences with qualifications or social padding. She said what she meant with the efficiency of someone for whom words were tools rather than currency. Harry said less than Hermione, but what he said had weight to it, the kind that comes not from deliberate gravitas, but from the fact that the person speaking has already considered the matter from every available angle and has arrived somewhere. Ron had never felt so thoroughly heard in his life. He discovered, somewhat to his surprise, that this was better than being agreed with. He introduced them to wizard chess on a wet Saturday in mid-October. The set had belonged to his great-uncle Bilius, whose pieces were elderly and opinionated and had extremely strong feelings about strategy that they communicated at volume. Harry defeated him in 6 moves. He showed no satisfaction. This was, Ron found, somehow more aggravating than satisfaction would have been. Satisfaction implied a contest. Harry's expression when the game ended had the quality of someone completing a small and necessary task. The expression you made after locking a door, not after winning something. Again, Ron said. Harry defeated him in 6 moves. Again, Ron said. Harry looked at him. You won't improve by repeating the same strategy. I know, but I'm figuring out what you do. Harry considered this. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it, close enough to matter. They played 4 more games. Ron lost all of them. He began on the 3rd to lose less efficiently, which was not the same as winning, but was demonstrably a start. Draco Malfoy found the corridor in late October. He brought Crabbe and Goyle, which was what Draco Malfoy brought to situations he was uncertain about. He had prepared something. One could tell. The speech had structure, it had been rehearsed, it had the careful architecture of an argument that someone has assembled from materials received rather than considered, blood status, family lineage, the hierarchy of the wizarding world as Draco had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his father, calcified now into something that felt to Draco like natural law rather than argument. because it had never been examined as anything else. He was 3 sentences in when Hermione turned to look at him. She did not raise her wand. She did not step forward. She moved only her head, the small complete pivot of someone who has located a sound and oriented toward its source. The corridor dropped several degrees. Not dramatically, the way temperature drops when a cloud moves between you and the sun, measurable, certain, immediate. Crabbe and Goyle went very still. Draco's prepared sentence stopped existing somewhere between its formation and its delivery, in the space where he had expected to find momentum, and found instead that the space was simply not there. Hermione said, with the patience of someone explaining directions to a person who has asked twice already, "We know what you are. You may go." Draco left. He spent the following week and a half returning to the memory and finding, each time, that it was exactly as he remembered it, that there had been no spell, no threat, no confrontation with any dramatic content, that a girl he outweighed by 30 pounds had turned to look at him and said 6 words and he had left. He came back to the corridor's entrance once, stood at it, did not cross the threshold. He did not return. That evening, Ron Weasley sat on his bed in the Gryffindor dormitory with a piece of parchment and crossed out 3 separate attempts at explaining before settling on what was simply true. Made 2 new friends. They're different, not bad different. Just, they see things. Hard to explain. I like them. He sealed it. He would send it in the morning with Errol, if Errol survived the journey, which was never guaranteed. Outside the dormitory window, the castle grounds lay quiet under an October dark, and 3 floors below, in the cold corridor, 2 doors stood closed against the light. Whatever waited behind them, whatever they were becoming or had already become, or had always been, waited with the patience of things that have understood, at some depth beneath thought, that time is less a river than it is a condition, and that conditions change on their own schedule. Not yours, theirs. The Great Hall on Halloween was a different creature from the Great Hall on ordinary nights. Jack-o'-lanterns grinned from every surface, 1,000 of them, their carved faces lit from within by actual fire rather than candles, their light shifting and orange and older feeling than anything electric. The ceiling showed a sky thick with clouds the color of bruises. Bats moved through the enchanted upper dark in formations that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. The food was good in the particular way of institutional celebration. Roast and pastry, and things made with the specific excess of a kitchen that had a holiday to justify using it. Ron Weasley was working methodically through his 3rd helping. At the far end of the table, Harry and Hermione ate in their usual register, present, deliberate, consuming enough to constitute eating without approaching anything like pleasure. Hermione had a book propped against a fruit bowl. Harry was watching the bats. He had been watching the bats for approximately 11 minutes when something in the castle changed. It was not a sound. It was not a smell. It was the specific quality of the air in a place when something wrong has entered it. The way a room shifts when a window breaks, not from the noise of the breaking, but from the sudden presence of outdoor cold where only indoor warmth had been. Harry set down his fork. Hermione turned a page, then Professor Quirrell crashed through the doors. The East Corridor, 3rd floor. The evacuation had the quality of 800 people all trying to exit a space through insufficient openings while also trying to understand what was happening. Prefects shouted. Younger students moved in the blind collective direction of a crowd that has decided speed is more important than destination. Ron Weasley went with it, craning his neck for Harry and Hermione in the surge, not finding them, and deciding, with the practical assessment of someone who has attended enough family emergencies to know that the people who understand what is happening rarely move in the same direction as everyone else, that they were probably fine. He was correct. Harry and Hermione moved against the current of the evacuation with the ease of people who are not afraid of what is coming, and are therefore not compelled to run from it. They did not discuss this. They moved through the emptying corridors with the particular directness of people who have already reached a conclusion and are simply following it to its location. They found the troll in the east corridor of the 3rd floor. It was 12 feet tall. It smelled of unwashed rock and cold mountain and something beneath both of those. Older, the smell of something removed from its proper place against its will. Its club was a section of uprooted tree, the root end still trailing clots of earth that had dried into the stone grain of the floor. Its eyes were small and yellow-gray, the color of old ice, and they located Harry and Hermione with the blunt efficiency of a creature that had been processing threats for centuries. It charged. Harry raised his hand. Not a wand, not a gesture shaped for any spell in any textbook that had ever been written or taught. His hand came up with the unhurried certainty of someone holding open a door, palm out, fingers loose, the particular quality of stopping something you are not afraid of. The troll stopped. It stopped 4 feet from Harry's outstretched hand, and the abruptness of it was such that the creature's own momentum nearly folded its legs beneath it. It stood. It breathed through its flat nose in long, heaving pulls. Its yellow-gray eyes moved over Harry's face and did not find there any of the things they had been built over centuries to locate. In the species memory of mountain trolls, carried not in any brain structure but in the blood itself, accumulated over millennia of moving through a world that contained things older than trolls. There was an entry. It had no language attached to it. It was not a thought. It was the encoded memory of a feeling. The feeling that preceded always the decision to go the other way. The feeling of having encountered something that occupied a category the blood recognized and the mind did not have words for. The troll went still. Hermione stepped forward. She was not looking at the troll's eyes, not from any foreknowledge of basilisks, which were still a year away, but because she did not need to. She was reading its soul the way she read everything, with the focused attention of someone locating a specific passage in a very long text. The soul of a mountain troll was not complex. It was ancient in the way that simple things become ancient, worn smooth by time into its essential shape, everything unnecessary removed by the long friction of existing. What she found in it was not malevolence. What she found was displacement. The troll had been taken. Not conjured from nothing. Trolls could not be conjured. They were creatures of the mortal world with their own cold territories and their own ancient customs of movement. It had been taken from somewhere remote, carried across distances that meant nothing to the magic that moved it, and everything to the creature that endured the moving, and deposited in a stone corridor that smelled of oil lamps and children, and none of the things it recognized as home. It had not chosen to be here. It had been used in the way that something without a voice is always available to be used by something with one. The violence it trailed behind it through the castle corridors was not intent. It was what displacement looked like when there was no language to express it any other way. Hermione said a word. It was not English, it was not Latin, not the debased Arabic of certain curse forms, not the Norse fragments preserved in older incantations. It was something from the void's deep grammar, the language of fundamental states rather than constructed meanings, the language that existed before the first wizard had thought to assign a word to what fire was or what death meant. It translated approximately as rest. The troll's eyes closed. It sat down, not falling, settling with the slow deliberateness of something very large choosing to place itself on the ground. Its club rolled 3 feet and came to rest against the corridor wall. Its enormous chest moved in the long, even rhythm of deep sleep, the rhythm of something that has been very tired for a very long time, and has finally been given permission to stop. It was not dead. It had been released from its stolen purpose, from its displacement, from the days of continuous wrongness that had constituted its existence since someone had decided it was available to be an instrument. In the morning, it would be returned to the mountains it came from. It would live another 40 years in the cold altitudes where it belonged, and it would carry in its blood, alongside all the other entries, a dim record of the corridor and the 2 children and the word that meant rest. Harry lowered his hand. The corridor held its silence. The professors arrived in stages, as professors do when the emergency has resolved itself before they reached it. Dumbledore came first. He turned the corner and stopped. He took in the situation with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has trained himself across 9 decades to see what is actually present rather than what he had anticipated finding. 2 first-year students, 1 unconscious mountain troll, no blood, no rubble, no evidence of any of the things that typically attended encounters of this kind. He had been hoping. He was scrupulously honest with himself about this in the private hours, the hours after midnight when the instruments in his office made their soft sounds and no one was watching the watching, that he had been wrong. Not wrong about what they were. That particular hope had expired on the night of September 1st. Wrong about the scale of it. Wrong about whether 2 children raised in Death's household would still be, in some meaningful sense, teachable, available to be shaped by a careful and experienced hand. The troll, breathing with the deep regularity of something at genuine peace, was not compatible with that hope. He said, because he was Dumbledore and he would find the appropriate register even with his chest doing what it was currently doing, remarkable. Are either of you hurt? No, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at the sleeping troll, then at Harry, then at Hermione. He weighed something in the space behind his half-moon spectacles, the weight of what he had just understood distributed against the weight of what he had planned, and found that the scales no longer agreed with each other the way they had when he'd last examined them. "Perhaps," he said, with the care of a man selecting each word from a diminished available supply, "we might discuss what happened here." "Perhaps," Harry said, nothing more. Quirrell arrived 4 minutes after Dumbledore. He had taken a longer route. He had needed the time. He had been directing the troll from a position of deliberate distance, and the troll had stopped relaying its progress in the specific way that commandeered creatures stopped relaying their progress when the connection to their commander had been severed without warning. He had used the 4 minutes to compose himself, which was a thing he had become skilled at, because the presence that shared his skull had no patience for discomposure and expressed its impatience in ways that left marks. He turned the corner and found Dumbledore, 2 first years, his instrument on the floor with its eyes closed and the expression of an animal that has, unexpectedly, been given exactly what it needed. He began constructing an explanation. He had the component parts available: surprise, concern, the breathless quality of a man who had been searching through the castle on behalf of the students. He assembled them with the practiced speed of someone who had been building cover stories for years, because years of building cover stories was precisely what he had. Hermione looked at him. She did not raise her wand. She did not move. She looked at him the way she looked at problems, with focused, complete attention, reading from left to right and from the surface downward, efficiently and without drama. In the 10 seconds of that attention, she read his soul entirely. What she found was not particularly complex. Guilt arranged in layers, each layer corresponding to a decision that had seemed individually like the only available option. Terror that had been present for so long it had become structural, not a response to specific danger, but the permanent condition of a man who had made himself into something a more powerful thing could inhabit. And beneath all of that, deeper and colder and categorically different from everything surrounding it, a presence. She recognized its quality immediately. She knew its signature, had read about its particular configuration, had discussed it with Harry with the precise language of people who had been taught the correct vocabulary. She understood, in the moment of recognition, exactly what Quirrell was, and what he carried, and what it meant for the year ahead. She filed it. She made a small sound. It was not alarm. It was not disgust. It was the sound a very thorough reader makes upon arriving at a chapter that turns out to be shorter and less demanding than the surrounding context suggested, the particular minor note of something found to be less interesting than anticipated. Quirrell's explanation stopped forming. He went white in the absolute sense. Not pale, not drained, but the color of something that has lost the internal resource that was generating its previous color. His mouth remained open. The stutter that emerged from it was not the cultivated stutter he had spent years maintaining as cover. It was the stutter of a man whose throat had received a message from some deeper part of him and declined to continue. He had crossed a line in a forest in Albania that had seemed in the moment like the only available direction. He had lived since then with the private architecture of a man who has done what others would not dare. He had assumed, in his worst imagined versions of discovery, that being truly seen would mean being seen as monstrous, which was survivable. Monstrousness had a grandeur to it. Monstrousness implied a scale that warranted attention. Hermione had examined him for 10 seconds with the focused disinterest of a cataloger processing a routine entry. She had made the small sound. She had looked away. Quirrell would spend the rest of the year at Hogwarts turning this over. He would lie in his cold office with the presence behind his skull making its continuous low demands, and he would return to it in the way that the mind returns to wounds, not to heal them, but because the location of the wound has become, itself, a landmark. He would examine the 10 seconds from every available angle. He would consider that he might survive being feared. He had evidence that suggested he could survive being hunted. He could not locate any mechanism by which he recovered from being found insufficient to sustain interest. The first petrification happened in November. Mrs. Norris, the caretaker's cat, found rigid in a second-floor corridor with her eyes turned to silver. Then Colin Creevey, a first year with a camera. Then Justin Finch-Fletchley. Then nearly headless Nick, which suggested to Hermione that the mechanism of attack moved through line of sight rather than proximity, because a ghost could not be petrified in the conventional biological sense, and whatever had found Nick had found him through the same channel as the others. She wrote the word basilisk in her notebook in December. She underlined it twice. She spent the following week cross-referencing the historical record of Salazar Slytherin's known architectural preferences with the topography of Hogwarts's lower levels and identified 3 possible locations for the chamber's entrance before narrowing them to 1. She had also, since January, been wearing a small mirror on a chain around her neck, because the distinction between direct sight and reflected sight was precisely the distinction that Hermione Granger did not overlook. She presented her findings to Harry on a Wednesday in February, with the delivery of someone offering a solution rather than a discovery. "Ginny Weasley has been losing time," she said. "She was found in a corridor at 2 a.m. last Tuesday with no memory of leaving her dormitory. Whatever is possessing the diary is accelerating. We go Friday." The Chamber of Secrets below Hogwarts, February 1993. The entrance was a sink basin in a girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor, not concealed so much as overlooked, in the way that certain secrets persist, not through active protection, but through the consistent failure of the people around them to ask the correct question. The pipe below it was wide enough for a person. The drop was long. What waited at the bottom of the drop was not a sewer. The chamber was old in the way that places become old when they have been built not for a decade or a generation, but for a span of time longer than most architectural intentions survive. Slytherin had not built it to last a lifetime. He had built it to last. The stone was dry despite its depth, lit by something green and sourceless that moved like light through shallow water. The columns rose to a ceiling lost in dark. The carved serpents on each pillar had their heads turned downward, not in threat but in the particular posture of something that has been keeping watch for so long that vigilance has become indistinguishable from rest. Harry and Hermione walked through it without speaking. There was nothing to say about it yet. At the far end of the serpent colonnade, they found the inner chamber. Ginny Weasley was on the floor, unconscious and breathing, her robes spread around her in the cold stone dust, her face white and very still in the green sourceless light. Nearby, a black diary lay open, its pages moving without wind, and above the diary, assembling itself from something that was not quite smoke and not quite shadow, was Tom Riddle. He was 16, and handsome in the particular way of someone who had understood very early that handsomeness was a resource, and had spent decades drawing on the account. He was not yet fully solid. The green light moved through him in places, found no resistance. But his eyes were already clear, already organized around the specific certainty of someone who considers every room he enters his natural domain. Harry turned his back on him entirely. He faced the far end of the chamber. The basilisk was there, as it had been there for 1,000 years, coiled in the deepest dark beyond the carved stone face of Slytherin, its body wider than a full-grown man, and its length beyond the reach of the green light. Ancient in the way the chamber was ancient, not decayed but accumulated, carrying its years the way a cliff carries the weight of the sea's attention, shaped by it without being diminished. Its scales were the color of old bronze in some lights and of deep water in others. Its eyes were closed. It was not sleeping. It was waiting, which was a different thing. The specific quality of stillness that belongs to something that has been waiting long enough that waiting has become its primary mode of existence, the thing it does in place of living. Harry stepped forward. He did not look at the basilisk's face. The danger of its gaze required intention, and the basilisk, in his presence, was not organizing itself toward intention. He could feel it the way he felt all old things, as weight, as depth, as the specific gravity the air takes on when something ancient occupies it. He had grown up in the void among things that made this creature seem young, and the basilisk's blood registered this without needing to be told. He spoke in Parseltongue, not the Parseltongue of the diary's consolidating shade, all command an instrument, the language is a tool of domination, shaped by someone who had learned it that way and never learned it any other. What came through Harry moved in a register beneath the hissing surface of it, operating in the frequency that the living serpent heard not through its ears, but through the part of it that processed the memory of before the chamber, before the statute, before the long diminishment of the magical world into something that could be codified and governed. The language of the void did not require effort. It moved through him the way water moves through an opening that is exactly the right shape for it. "You are old," he said. "You are tired. You have been kept here against your will for 1,000 years. I am not here to kill you." A pause. The pause of someone choosing the next words with care. "I am here to give you a choice." The basilisk's eyes opened. They were gold, not the yellow-gray of the troll's exhausted ice, but gold with the particular quality of something precious that has never been correctly valued. Gold that has been buried. They found Harry with the slow precision of something that has not needed to move quickly in a very long time. And in them was something Harry recognized without being able to name it in English, because English did not have the word for it. The void did. The basilisk lowered its head. The motion was not submission, it was recognition. The motion of something that has lived 1,000 years without being accurately seen, and has finally been seen. Its head came to rest on the chamber floor 3 feet from where Harry stood, and the weight of it moved through the stone beneath his feet like a slow tide. Harry said, still in the language beneath language, "Stay. Be what this place needs rather than what it has been made to contain. When the time comes, when the chamber's purpose is finished and its guardianship is no longer required, I will open the correct gate myself. You have my word." Not in the waiting quality of before, in the quality of something that has made a decision and is resting inside it, the specific stillness of rest, chosen rather than endured. Harry turned back to the chamber. Lockhart had followed them down. Of course he had. Gilderoy Lockhart had spent the better part of a decade perfecting a specific relationship to other people's resolutions, arriving at the conclusion, absorbing it, presenting it to the world with himself occupying the center of it. He had a genuine talent for this. He had built 7 best-selling books and a fan correspondence that occupied 3 house elves full-time on the foundation of this talent, and none of it had required him to be present for the dangerous portion of any given event. Only the aftermath. Only ever the aftermath. He had his wand raised. His opening sentence was assembled. Hermione read his soul before he completed raising it. She did it the way she did everything she was thorough about, completely from the beginning, without the pauses that less practiced processes required. She found a man of genuine charm and genuine intelligence and genuine capacity for courage about precisely one thing, the taking of courage from others. 43 separate memories that did not belong to him. She found their architecture, their origins, the wizards and witches they had been removed from without permission, some of whom had recovered, some of whom had not. Some of whom had spent years haunted by the inexplicable gap where something important used to be. She said, "What you have done to the people whose stories you stole is soul theft. Every memory you have taken belongs to someone else." A pause. "We are going to return them." Lockhart's opening sentence did not happen. What happened was a returning, not dramatic, not loud, conducted entirely without the ceremony that the wizarding world associated with powerful operations. The stolen memories left him with the quality of something going home. 43 separate pieces of other people's lived experience vacated the space they had occupied in Gilderoy Lockhart, and the space they left was vast in the specific way that spaces are vast when what filled them was the entire architecture of a self-concept. His wand dropped. He did not bend to retrieve it. He was left with Gilderoy Lockhart, the actual man, the one that had always existed beneath the borrowed scaffolding, the one he had decided at some point in his youth was insufficient, and had spent the subsequent decades replacing with something more interesting. He sat down on the chamber floor. He put his face in his hands. He would spend the rest of his life as an honest man. This was, Hermione had assessed, a more thorough consequence than anything Azkaban would have provided, because Azkaban had an end. Tom Riddle had been watching all of this. He had consolidated enough to stand, enough to speak, enough to project the cool authority of someone who has decided he is the most relevant presence in any room he occupies. He arranged his half-solid attention toward Harry with the confidence of a man drawing a weapon he has never had cause to doubt. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," he said, in the voice he had spent his Hogwarts years perfecting. Harry looked at him. Hermione looked at him. Something passed between them in approximately half a second. Not words, not a look that required words, but the particular exchange of people who have known each other long enough that certain categories of decision resolve without language. Harry picked up the diary from the chamber floor. "Don't," Riddle began. Harry set the diary carefully in front of the basilisk's lowered head. The basilisk did not require instruction. It opened one eye. It moved with the deliberate economy of something that has learned, across centuries, not to waste motion. The venom fang descended. The diary split along its spine. The black substance that poured from it was not ink. It moved against gravity, against sense, with the desperate purposefulness of something that has been given a structure to inhabit and is losing it. The shade of Tom Riddle came apart the way shadows come apart when the light shifts, all at once, without a sound the mortal ear could name. Ginny Weasley drew a sharp breath. Her eyes opened. She looked at the ceiling of the Chamber of Secrets for a long moment, with the expression of someone confirming that the surface is real before committing fully to having surfaced. Harry crouched beside her. "Can you walk?" She sat up. She looked at him. She looked at the sleeping basilisk. She looked at Lockhart sitting quietly against the chamber wall in the early stages of his honest life. "Yes," she said, in the voice of someone filing several questions for a later date. "Good," Harry said. "We're going up." Lucius Malfoy was waiting at the top of the stairs. He was composing. One could always tell with Lucius Malfoy when he was constructing the shape of events. There was a specific quality to his stillness in those moments, a stillness that was the opposite of inactivity. He had an explanation for the ministry assembled and ready, and a practiced expression of deep concern for the Weasley girl, and several interlocking clauses about the regrettable dangers of second-hand school supplies, and Dobby standing quietly at his elbow as evidence of his innocent presence in the vicinity. Harry walked past him. 3 steps beyond. 4. He stopped. He did not turn around. "The artifact you placed in Ginny Weasley's possession," Harry said. To the corridor ahead, to the middle distance, to the air that happened to be in front of him rather than behind him where Lucius Malfoy stood, was a soul fragment belonging to your master. "In our Father's ledger, the debt for that trespass is recorded under your name." He walked on. Hermione followed. Ginny followed, not looking back. Behind them, Dobby made a very small sound that was not quite a sob, and not quite a laugh, and contained in its brevity approximately 11 years of things he had not been able to say. Lucius Malfoy stood in the corridor outside the Chamber of Secrets. His assembled explanation was present in his mind, fully formed and ready, and it no longer had a target he could identify. The encounter had lasted 4 seconds. He had not spoken a word. He stood. When he finally moved, something had changed in the quality of his stride. Not fear. Fear was immediate, sharp, resolved by the removal of the threatening thing. This was something more patient than fear. The particular gait of a man who has, for the first time in a life constructed on the assumption that accounting was for lesser people, genuinely considered that he might one day be asked to account for himself. He did not know when. He did not know in what form the asking would come. But the name of the ledger was in his head now, and names, once entered into a person's understanding, had a way of declining to leave. The Dementor found their compartment somewhere between Edinburgh and the Highlands, in the grey hour when the light outside went from steel to slate, and the landscape became the particular formless dark that exists at the edge of northern weather. It opened the compartment door without touching the handle. It stood in the doorway, cloaked, hooded, 8 feet of concentrated wrongness, and the temperature dropped immediately, not gradually, but all at once, as if the air had been informed of a new policy. Ron Weasley, who had been mid-sentence about something involving the Chudley cannons, stopped being mid-sentence. The cold reached into him and found, with the efficiency of something that has been doing this for centuries, the exact reservoir of memory that would produce the most thorough despair. His mother's voice, frightened from a kitchen argument he was not supposed to have overheard. His brother's easy brilliance measured against his own in the accounting that ran constantly beneath his daily thoughts. Every moment he had ever spent certain that the space he occupied in the world was borrowed rather than his. He gripped the seat with both hands. He could not speak. The Dementor was not looking at Ron. It was looking at Harry. Harry met its gaze, if gaze was the correct word for what moved beneath the hood. If what existed there constituted looking in any sense the word had been built to describe, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, unhurried, requiring no preparation. The Dementor was a thing of Death's household, inefficient and primitive in the way that very old tools are primitive, built for a purpose before the purpose was fully understood, but recognizable. Harry recognized it the way you recognize a distant relation you have never met, by the quality of the air around them rather than any specific feature. The Dementor tilted forward. Not fully, not the elaborate genuflection it would eventually produce under different circumstances and with fuller understanding of who it was addressing. Just enough, the deliberate inclination of its hooded form, the step backward from the doorway, the quality of retreat that was not retreat but acknowledgement. It moved on down the corridor. The cold lifted from the compartment in stages. Ron's hands unclenched. He exhaled. He looked at Harry and Hermione with the expression of someone who has just had an experience that does not fit any existing category and is not yet sure how to file the contents. Beside Harry, Hermione was writing in her notebook, small, precise letters. She completed the entry before looking up. "They recognize us," she said, without drama and without emphasis. "They're Death's agents in some sense, primitive but affiliated. They know whose household we belong to." She closed the notebook. This will be useful. Ron decided, on balance, not to ask what useful meant in this context. Hogwarts, Autumn and Winter 1993. Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban, which the wizarding world considered impossible and was therefore finding difficult to process. Dementors were stationed at the castle's gates. The prophet ran his photograph on the front page for 3 weeks. The same image each time, a hollow-faced man whose eyes had the quality of something that had spent too long in one place. Students learned to move through the grounds quickly after dark. Certain corridors acquired reputations. Harry and Hermione moved through the castle the same way they always had. The Dementors at the main gates did not approach them. When Harry passed within 20 feet on a gray October evening, they turned their hooded faces toward him and held a posture that was technically upright but contained at its edges the memory of the bow on the train. Hermione documented this. She documented everything. She found it on a Thursday evening in November, on a routine read. She periodically read the souls of things in Ron's possession, not from suspicion, but because thoroughness did not make exceptions for the things it did not expect to find. Scabbers was old for a rat, which she had noted before and filed as an anomaly. On this Thursday she read further than the anomaly. What she found was not a rat's soul. It was layered in a way that animal souls were not layered, complex, stratified, carrying the accumulated weight of human decision-making across decades. Guilt in quantities that no creature without language had the capacity to accumulate. A consciousness compressed into animal form, with the particular quality of something that has been hiding long enough to half convince itself the hiding is permanent. She found the shape of a man's choices, folded down to fit inside a pocket. She told Harry. Harry told Ron the following morning, in the empty classroom they had been using for quiet conversation since second year. He told him carefully, with the specific care of someone who knows what they are delivering will hurt, and who has decided that the hurt of knowing is smaller than the hurt of not knowing, but who does not pretend the first hurt is nothing. Ron sat with it for a long time. Then he said, "You've known since yesterday." "Since yesterday evening," Harry said. "Hermione found it and told you first." Not quite a question. Yes. Ron nodded. The motion had a quality to it that was not anger and was not acceptance, and occupied the specific territory between them where things that cannot yet be processed go to wait. He picked up his bag. He left the classroom. He came back 2 hours later and said, without preamble, "What are we going to do about it?" The Hogwarts grounds. Late November, 3 in the morning, Harry stood at the edge of the castle's warded boundary and spoke into the dark. Not loudly, not in any incantation that existed in a text Hermione had catalogued, because what he was issuing predated incantations. He spoke in the register the void's affiliated creatures recognized, the register that said, "I have standing here, I am calling on affiliates. Come." They came from the tree line in stages. 2 first, moving across the frosted ground with the motion of something that does not need to consider the terrain beneath it. Then 5 more, then 9 arranged in a loose formation at the distance of an audience. Harry said, "There is a hiding soul on these grounds, a human consciousness in animal form, carrying 12 outstanding debts. Find it. Hold it. Do not touch it." The Dementors dispersed across the grounds. Hermione stood beside Harry with her notebook open, documenting the angle of their departure and the elapsed time, because the event would not be fully recorded until it was recorded. Ron stood 2 feet behind them both, with his hands in his pockets. His face was doing the thing it had been doing since the classroom, the thing that was not anger, not acceptance, not quite grief, but carried the characteristics of all 3 without resolving into any one of them. He was watching his rat somewhere out there in the dark, held by things that had just taken instructions from his friend, and he was finding that he had no framework for this that did not hurt. The Dementors located Peter Pettigrew in the roots of the Homping Willow in 11 minutes. The transformation back to human form was not voluntary. His disguised soul, pinned from multiple directions by the weight of what surrounded it, could not maintain the compression required to stay small. He emerged from the root hollow with the involuntary quality of something expelled, rather than something that is chosen to surface. Small, gray, trembling, blinking in the dark with the eyes of a man who has spent 12 years perfecting his disappearance and has just run out of space. He saw Harry. He saw Hermione. He began to cry. It was not dramatic crying. It was the crying of someone who is very tired and has been very tired for a very long time, and has finally arrived at a place from which there is nowhere further to run, and the body, presented with the end of running, simply stops producing the alternative. Hermione looked at him with the focused attention of someone reading a document they have already partially mapped. Peter Pettigrew, she said, you have 12 outstanding debts. She did not consult anything, the ledger was not a physical object. It was simply available to her, the way that certain knowledge becomes available to people trained to read it. 3 to the Potters, 1 to Sirius Black, 4 to the Order of the Phoenix's Fallen, 2 to the Longbottoms, 1 to the general accounting of the mortal world. She paused. You will be delivered to the relevant authorities. Sirius Black is innocent, and his freedom is your first outstanding obligation. Pettigrew said nothing. He was still crying, with the quality of a man who has run out of arguments as thoroughly as he has run out of directions. The Dementors held him where he was. Behind Harry and Hermione, Ron stood very still in the winter dark and looked at the small, wet, shaking man in the roots of the Whomping Willow, the man who had lived in his pocket for 11 years, who had sat on his bed and eaten his food and been, in the particular way of childhood companions, simply there, and did not say anything at all. There was nothing to say. Harry and Hermione had said what needed saying, in the language they used for things that needed saying, and it had been correct. And Ron's rat had been a man this whole time, and the language Harry and Hermione used for things was not a language Ron had been taught. He filed this away alongside the classroom, alongside the 2 hours, alongside all the other entries accumulating in the ledger he had been keeping, without meaning to, since second year. Sirius Black's innocence was formally established within the week. Peter Pettigrew, questioned under veritaserum before the Wisengamot, confessed to everything: the secret-keeping, the betrayal, the 12 Muggle deaths produced in his escape. The confession had the quality of a man who has been carrying something for 12 years and has been relieved of it, not by choice, but because the carrying simply stopped being possible. Sirius Black walked out of ministry custody on a Thursday in December. He walked into cold London air with the careful quality of a man relearning what voluntary forward motion felt like, practicing it in real time, finding it stranger than he had remembered. He did not flee. He did not disappear. He was free, and free was a thing he was going to have to learn how to be. Cornelius Fudge arrived at Hogwarts 2 days later with a statement and an escort. The statement concerned due process, ministerial oversight, and the importance of formal review periods in cases involving escaped prisoners. The escort consisted of 4 Dementors, because the paperwork for Sirius Black's imprisonment had been completed correctly the first time, and Cornelius Fudge was a man who respected paperwork completed correctly, and it had not fully occurred to him yet that correct and right were not interchangeable categories. He was composing the opening paragraph of his statement in the entrance hall when Harry stepped into his path. Fudge looked at him, 13 years old, school robes, untidy hair. "Stand aside, son," he said, with the confidence of a man who has spent his entire career being obeyed by people whose job descriptions required them to obey him and had not developed habits of preparation for the alternative. "This is ministry business." The Dementors at Fudge's back had already bowed, not in any way that could be formally documented as bowing. If pressed at an inquiry, Fudge would not have been able to specify under oath exactly what their posture had constituted. But the inclination of their forms, the particular quality of the step backward, the manner in which they arranged themselves in Harry's presence relative to how they arranged themselves in everyone else's, Fudge became aware of this now, and the awareness moved through him in a way that did not improve his composure. They would not move against Sirius Black. They would not, in fact, move at all. Harry said, "Peter Pettigrew confessed. Sirius Black is innocent. You may process that however you like, Minister." His voice did not rise. It had no need to rise. "Those are the facts." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "Our father has no outstanding debt to Sirius Black. He will not be returning to Azkaban." Cornelius Fudge opened his mouth. He looked at his escort, which was bowing, technically, in a way that would be very difficult to explain in writing. He looked at Harry. He looked at Hermione Granger, positioned slightly to Harry's left with her notebook open and her pen in the manner of someone recording proceedings for a record that existed somewhere other than the ministry's filing system. He made several sounds that were not words. Then, because the alternative was a public confrontation with 2 13-year-olds in front of castle staff, while his Dementor escort demonstrated in clear physical terms that they had a prior commitment, he agreed. Cornelius Fudge was, above all things, a man who understood how things looked, and how this looked was not something he intended to be documented. His aide would later note that the pardon paperwork for Sirius Orion Black was the most rapidly completed document the minister had ever authorized. The cloak of invisibility had been folded in a desk drawer in Albus Dumbledore's office for 13 years. Not hidden, Dumbledore did not hide things he could simply place somewhere and not mention. It was folded with the care that one brings to objects whose significance is not fully understood, and is therefore being treated with the respect of the uncertain, tucked beneath a sheaf of parchment in the second drawer on the left, patient in the dark. 13 years is not a long time for an object that predates the Ministry of Magic by 4 centuries. The cloak had passed through the hands of Ignotus Peverell's descendants in a continuous line of inheritance, sometimes decades between one bearer and the next, sometimes longer. Waiting was not a hardship. Waiting was simply what it did when it found itself between one home and the next. But 13 years of the wrong place had a specific quality. It accumulated, the way a sound accumulates in a room with nowhere to go. Between 3rd and 4th year, Hogwarts, July 1994, Albus Dumbledore had been keeping the cloak for specific reasons he had examined honestly, which meant he had been keeping it for specific reasons he had found adequate after examination, which was the particular operation that distinguished him from lesser forms of self-deception. He had told himself, the boy needs preparation. He had told himself, the cloak is safest here until the boy is ready. He had told himself, in the private hours when the silver instruments made their quiet sounds, and the portraits breathed slowly and without honesty, I will know when he is ready. He had told himself this across 3 years of watching Harry Potter move through his school. He set his quill down when Harry walked in. He did not hear the door. He did not think the door had opened in any conventional sense. Harry was simply in the office, sitting in the chair across from the desk with the settled quality he brought to everything. Not defiant, not aggressive, present in the way that things are present when they have already concluded their deliberation and are here to communicate the result. Harry, Dumbledore said, in the tone he had spent decades calibrating, warm, faintly amused, the practiced warmth of a man who had learned that warmth was among the most effective disarming tools available. This is a surprise, Harry said. I've come for the cloak. In the silence that followed, the office sounded itself, the whirring of silver instruments on their brackets. Fawkes adjusting on his perch, the Phoenix turned his scarlet head toward Harry with the particular attention he reserved for things he found significant, which was not everything, which made his attention a precise instrument. The slow breath of past headmasters' portraits, maintaining the fiction of sleep. I see, Dumbledore said, finally. It belonged to Ignotus Peverell, Harry said. It came to my father by direct descent. It should have come to me in 1981. A pause that was not hesitate. Harry did not hesitate. He simply allowed statements the space they required. You have held it for 13 years. I was keeping it safe. You were keeping it. Harry's voice did not rise. It had no need to rise. There is a difference, Headmaster. Dumbledore was quiet. He looked at Harry, genuinely looked in the way he had permitted himself to do only rarely across the past 3 years, because looking at Harry Potter with genuine attention consistently produced information he was not prepared to act on. What he saw now was a 14-year-old boy who had arrived at his desk with the settled authority of someone delivering a decision rather than making a request. Watching him with a quality of patience that was entirely without cruelty and entirely without accommodation. He said, I had reasons. I know your reasons, Harry said. I've read them in the way my father reads records. Your care for your students, your genuine investment in the outcome of what is coming, your belief that you can manage the distance between what you want and what you intend better than anyone who has tried before. He looked at the desk between them, and your certainty that the wand in your possession should remain there until you decide otherwise. Dumbledore went very still. That last part, Harry said, is not a conversation for today, but it is a conversation that is coming. He waited. The cloak is. What happened next was not Dumbledore's decision. The second drawer on the left opened, not smoothly, with the particular quality of something that has been in one position for a long time and is making its first movement. Deliberate, unhurried, certain. The sheaf of parchment on top shifted. The cloak beneath unfolded itself. It did not billow or flutter. It moved the way that precise things move when they are finally going where they are meant to go, with direction, with the complete absence of waste. Through the air in a single continuous motion, across the desk, past Dumbledore's hands which remained exactly where they were, and onto Harry's shoulders. It settled. That was the only word for it. It settled, the way a key settles into a lock built specifically for it. The way a name settles in the mouth when you finally remember how to say it correctly. It arranged itself around Harry with the ease of something that had been here before, and was not surprised to be back. Harry sat for a moment with his hands resting on his knees, and did not do anything at all. The cloak did not make him invisible. He had not pulled it up. It simply lay across his shoulders the way a coat lies across a person in a house they own, worn, familiar, entirely without theater. And something in the air of the office shifted in a way that Dumbledore, with 9 decades of sensitivity to magical change, registered immediately and could not categorize. Not power, not threat. Something that had been absent was present, and its presence rearranged the structure of the room around it the way that a correct piece rearranges a composition, not by being dramatic but by being right, and the rightness being apparent the moment it arrived. Dumbledore's expression was, for a man who had maintained a serene face through 2 dark wars, through the death of his sister, through 50 years of carrying the Elder Wand and the weight that came with it, cracked, not destroyed. The architecture was still there, the careful construction of calm that he had built across a century, but something had moved through it and left its mark. The first genuine fracture in the conviction that he had managed this correctly. He said quietly, "What are you going to do?" Not dismissively, with the genuine attention of someone for whom the question has been asked in good faith and deserves a good faith answer. "Our job," he said, "which is the same thing we have always been doing." He stood. The cloak moved with him, adjusted, remained. "I would ask you to stay out of it, headmaster. I know you won't, but I would ask." Behind him, Fawkes sang a single note, short, neither celebratory nor mourning, the sound of something that has witnessed what it has been waiting to witness, and is marking the occasion before returning to the continuous work of what it is. Dumbledore sat for a long time. The second drawer on the left was still open. He looked at it. He looked at the parchment that had been over the cloak, slightly displaced as if the drawer's contents had made a decision without consulting the drawer's owner. He closed it. There was nothing in it now. Hermione, when Harry told her, spent approximately 15 seconds doing what she always did with significant information, organizing it against the existing architecture of what she already knew, what she knew about Albus Dumbledore's soul she had read once, lightly, in a moment when proximity had made it available, his genuine love for his students, his genuine investment in their survival, his genuine terror of what it would mean to step back from the center of events after 70 years of standing there. His love for control, which he had dressed as responsibility for so long that the original garment was no longer visible beneath it. His actual motivation, which she had identified and filed under a heading that she had not shared with anyone, including Harry, because Harry had asked her to stay out of Dumbledore's soul and she had complied, mostly, but one reading had already been done before the request and the contents did not expire. "He's going to accelerate his plans," she said. "He was hoping he had more time." "He doesn't," Harry said. "No," Hermione agreed, "he doesn't." She picked up her pen. She added 2 lines to the entry she had been maintaining, under the heading she had assigned it. She closed the notebook. Outside the window, the July grounds of Hogwarts lay green and quiet, in the particular way of places that are holding their breath between one thing and the next. She did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say yet. Dolores Umbridge intercepted Harry in the corridor outside the Great Hall at the end of year ceremony. She had been invited on grounds of ministry representation at school events, a formality that had existed for decades and had never previously involved anyone whose smile operated the way Umbridge's smile operated. She was carrying a clipboard. The clipboard had contents. She indicated this. She explained, in the voice of someone who has learned to deliver authority in the register of pleasantry, so the target does not recognize the nature of what is being said until it is too late to object naturally, that she would need to conduct a review of certain irregular incidents involving Harry and his companion across the current year and the 2 prior, under the terms of Educational Decree No. Harry looked at her clipboard. He said, "No." Umbridge blinked. In her professional experience, which was considerable and which she had accumulated through the specific practice of deploying authority against people who did not have the standing to contest it, children said many things when faced with authority delivered in the correct register. They said, "Yes, Professor." They said, "I understand, Professor." They said nothing at all while their expressions did the objecting on their behalf, which she found even more satisfying because silent objection was objection she did not have to document. They did not say no. No was not a word that had ever found allocation in the structure of her interactions with students, because the structure did not contain a space for it. She began to explain in the voice she reserved for remedial comprehension the terms of ministry oversight as they applied to irregularities within school grounds, the specific legislative framework that governed her authority to conduct such reviews, and the various consequences that attended non-compliance with ministry directives at the educational level. Harry said, with precisely the same inflection as before, identical in every measurable quality to the first instance, no louder, no more emphatic, simply accurate, no. Umbridge stood in the corridor with her clipboard and her smile and the growing awareness, not sharp, not immediate, but expanding the way cold expands in a room when the fire goes out, steadily and from all sides at once, that her clipboard did not apply here, that whatever she had just encountered was not organized within the categories her framework had been built to address, that she had arrived at a door and said the words that opened all the other doors, and this one had simply remained closed, and she could not locate the mechanism for forcing it, because the mechanism presupposed a kind of authority that this corridor in this moment was not organized around. She wrote something on her clipboard. She would return. She had the specific persistence of someone who has confused her own continuity for correctness, and that confusion was thorough enough to survive most counter-evidence. But the corridor was empty. Harry was already gone. She stood in it alone for a moment, her smile maintaining its position through the force of long habit, and then walked back in the direction of the ceremony. The clipboard was still open in her hand. She did not look down at what she had written. The goblet of fire produced 3 names on the night of October 31st, as it had been designed to do. Then it produced a 4th piece of parchment. The 4th piece was blank, not empty in the way of a mistake, not charred at the edges or smudged with failed inscription, blank in the way of something that has tried to write a category and found the category does not exist in its available vocabulary. The goblet had been enchanted over several centuries to recognize and select magical potential of a specific type. It had never encountered what it encountered now, and it improvised the only way that very old enchantments improvise. It produced something unprecedented, and let the room determine what to do with it. The room did not determine what to do with it. Dumbledore looked at the blank parchment for a long time, then at Harry, then at Hermione. Something moved through his expression that he managed, with effort, to keep from arriving on his face. "A malfunction," Percy Weasley said from somewhere in the crowd, with the confidence of someone who prefers technical explanations to unsettling ones. Several people agreed, because agreement was easier. Harry and Hermione did not refuse. Refusing would require a quality of self-interested concern about the outcome that they did not have access to. The tournament was a set of trials, and they had been given trials before, and observing how trials were constructed by people who did not know what they were constructing was, in its way, instructive. They would participate. They would complete it. They would do so in the way they did everything, without theater, without the performance of effort. Task 1. November. The arena. The Hungarian horntail was the most dangerous dragon available to the tournament's organizers, and the crowd had assembled with the anticipatory quality of people who have come to see something dangerous and are beginning to receive confirmation. The horntail emerged into the arena with the energy of something that has been confined and resents it. Claws on stone, wings half spread, yellow eyes already cataloging threats. It saw the egg. It saw Harry and Hermione standing at the arena's entrance. It stopped, not from hesitation, not from any confusion about what it was looking at, from the specific recognition that certain creatures carry in their blood, old enough to predate the domestication of the magical world and the statute that had progressively narrowed what magic was permitted to be. The horntail had in its ancestral memory an entry it could not have named, but that moved through it now with absolute authority. When you encounter that, do not approach. It backed against the far wall of the arena. It made a low sound, not a roar, something closer to what very large things produce when they are comprehensively reassessing their situation. Harry and Hermione walked across the arena floor. Harry picked up the golden egg. Hermione noted the horntail's exact position and the sound it had produced in her notebook, which she had brought into the arena because she had not seen any rule prohibiting it. They walked back. The crowd was very quiet for a very long time. Task 2. February. The lake. The water was black and cold and 30 feet deep at the point where Ron Weasley and Ginny Weasley had been placed by the tournament's enchantments, held in magically induced sleep at the lake bottom, each anchored as a champion's most precious thing. The phrasing was the tournament's. The tournament had this year made several categorization errors. Harry and Hermione entered the water without ceremony. They did not need to breathe underwater in any conventional sense. The void was not a place of air. The transition from surface to depth was a transition, a different medium. carrying different information. They moved through the black water with the directness of people who know where they are going because they can feel the weight of what they are going to find. The mer people came to meet them, not to challenge, not to obstruct. The mer people were ancient, older than the school above them, older than the statute, with their own relationship to deep water and what deep water contained. Their queen looked at Harry and Hermione with the assessment of something that has maintained its customs across millennia, and recognizes when those customs require modification for a specific occasion. They provided an escort. Harry and Hermione surfaced in 4 minutes with Ron and Ginny between them, and the merpeople's honor guard surfaced briefly alongside before returning to the deep in a motion that was unmistakably a bow. Task 3. June. The maze, the enchanted hedges, were 20 feet tall, and within them moved the creatures the tournament's organizers had placed for adequate challenge. Harry and Hermione moved through the maze the way they moved through everything, and the creatures within it did what the dragon and the merpeople had done, each in their own register, which was to register what they were dealing with and make the appropriate adjustment. The acromantula pressed itself to the hedge wall and did not move. The boggart, which required a clear sense of its target's deepest fear to function, encountered Harry and Hermione and could not locate, in either of them, anything that registered as fear in any form it was designed to engage. It collapsed into a formless shape and stayed there. At the maze's center, the Sphinx was waiting. She had a riddle prepared. The tradition of the challenge, the mechanism by which she sorted those worth letting through from those worth keeping out. She opened her mouth, she looked at Harry, she looked at Hermione, she answered her own riddle. One word, quiet, with the quality of confirming something she had already known, and stepped aside without requiring either of them to speak. They took the cup together. The Riddle Family Graveyard, June 24th, 1995. The portkey landed them in the dark. The graveyard was old, headstones worn smooth by weather, the grass long and unattended, the yew trees at its edges large enough to have been there before anyone currently living had been born. Wormtail was there, free for the past several months, having become a rat in his ministry holding cell and slipped through a ventilation gap that the containment protocols had never anticipated, because the ministry's comprehensive system of warded restraints had not been designed with an unregistered animagus in mind. A small gray shape at the edge of the torchlight, carrying something that Harry recognized immediately by its quality of wrongness, by the faint gray luminescence in his scar that said, "Stolen property, stolen soul." The ritual was already in motion before they arrived. There was no preventing it. The design required specific components, and the components were already assembled, and Harry's blood was the last of them, taken quickly, a cut on the arm, and the blood already dissolving into the potion before either of them could intervene in the sequence. The cauldron boiled white. What emerged was tall, pale, arriving in the world with the specific quality of something that has been waiting a long time and has not improved its relationship with patience in the waiting. Lord Voldemort, newly bodied, newly anchored, turning red eyes toward the assembled graveyard with the expression of someone about to address an audience, assembled in his honor. He saw Harry, he saw Hermione, he looked at them for a moment with the expression of a man who prepared for one thing and found another, rapidly reorganizing. He had expected a champion, alone and frightened, at the end of a long night of enchantment and confusion. He had found 2 14-year-olds standing in his graveyard, with the quality of people who had arrived at a prior appointment and were waiting for him to finish being reborn so the meeting could proceed. He turned to the Death Eaters emerging from the shadows, apparating into torchlight in ones and twos, kneeling, and he began to speak. The return, the triumph, the beginning of a new era. He had prepared this address. It required delivery. He managed approximately a third of it. Tom Riddle. Voldemort stopped. He had not been called Tom Riddle by anyone in 40 years. The name had been carefully excised from every context where it might appear, from the mouths of his followers, from ministry records, from the language of the wizarding world, which had replaced it first with he who must not be named, and eventually, in fear's final refinement, with silence itself. The name had become so thoroughly absent that its absence was its own kind of power. Harry had said it with the quality of someone reading from a record, not mocking, not weaponizing, simply accurate. Tom Riddle, that was what the ledger had him recorded as. That was what he was. "You have created 7 violations of the natural order," Harry said. The graveyard was very still. The Death Eaters who had been kneeling remained kneeling, not from allegiance to Harry but from the particular quality of stillness that has moved beyond available categories. They have been noted and recorded. You are not ready to be collected. The terms of the natural order require that every soul reach its conclusion through its own actions, and you have not yet reached yours. Harry tilted his head slightly. But we wanted you to know that we are aware of your account. All 7 entries. Voldemort stood in his graveyard with his new body and his assembled followers, and 40 years of accumulated certainty about the hierarchy of power in the world. And he experienced something that his decades of deliberate self-modification had left him without architecture to properly receive. He had burned out fear through the creation of his anchors. He had burned out doubt through the progressive removal of everything that generates it. He had, through the specific violence of 7 Horcruxes, dismantled most of the capacities that would allow him to process what was happening now correctly. What remained was the shadow of those capacities, the negative space where they had been, the awareness arriving without the emotional vocabulary to contain it, that he was not the most powerful thing in this graveyard. He raised his wand. The killing curse left it with the force of someone who has never had a curse fail and does not expect this to be the occasion. Green light crossed the graveyard. Hermione raised one hand. The curse stopped, 2 feet from her palm, not rebounded, not deflected, stopped in the way that a word stops when a conversation has moved past the point where that word applies. It held in the air for a moment, with the quality of something encountering an authority it did not have the standing to contest. Then it dissolved. Without sound, without residue. Not today, Hermione said. Your account is not yet settled. The graveyard held its stillness. The Death Eaters were not moving. Several were not technically breathing. Bellatrix Lestrange had her wand raised and her expression organized around absolute conviction, and at the conviction's edges, something was forming that the conviction had never previously contained, a quality of internal questioning that it had no established mechanism for processing. Harry looked at Voldemort for a moment with the steady, dispassionate attention of someone who has reviewed a file and confirmed its contents. "We'll see you again," he said. They took the portkey. They left Voldemort standing in his graveyard with his reborn body and his assembled Death Eaters, and the knowledge settling into him now with the patience of something that intends to stay, that he had been audited and his account had been found insufficient, and that when the conclusion of his story came, it would come on a schedule that was not his own, and that he had no mechanism for accelerating. Hogwarts. The same night, the crowd at the tournament's conclusion was in a state the organizers had not prepared for. Not celebration, not grief. The specific collective paralysis of people who have witnessed something that did not fit the narrative structure they had assembled for the evening, and are in the process of deciding whether to acknowledge this or simply wait until a more comfortable interpretation becomes available. Bartemius Crouch Jr. Revealed in the aftermath, the false Moody's disguise failing with the quality of something that has been maintained past its natural endpoint. The real man emerging with his father's hollowed eyes and his years of Azkaban written into the particular tension of his jaw, was not prepared to let the evening end without having his say. He had been waiting years for this. He was a true believer, and true believers have things they need to say when the moment they have sacrificed everything for finally arrives. He began with the Dark Lord's return, because that was where any correct account of the evening had to begin, and he intended to continue with the glory, the inevitability, the world that would now be remade in the image. Harry and Hermione turned from the crowd and looked at him. Hermione said, without particular emphasis, with the quality of someone addressing a minor administrative matter at the conclusion of a long evening, "We know what you've done. You may sit down." He had been standing. He had been mid-sentence. The sentence had felt important. And then something had shifted in the air with the quality of a door being quietly and completely closed, and he had sat down and he could not locate the mechanism for standing back up, and the sentence was gone, and the evening was over. The ministry handled the rest. By October of their 5th year, Ron had been keeping a list he had not meant to keep. It was not a written list. Ron was not a list maker. That was Hermione, who had lists within lists cross-referenced with other lists in a system he had spent 4 years trying to understand before giving up in the autumn of 2nd year. Ron's list was the kind that accumulates in the back of a mind paying attention without fully acknowledging that it is paying attention. The specific register of someone who has noticed something is wrong, but has not yet decided what to do with the noticing. Item 1. Harry's laugh. They were at breakfast in mid-September when Fred Weasley delivered what was, objectively, one of the better jokes of the year. Something involving Umbridge and a series of increasingly improbable ministry forms, executed with the timing Fred had spent 17 years developing. The table laughed. Ron laughed. Harry, half a second after everyone else, which was the kind of interval that would mean nothing to someone who was not paying attention, produced a sound that was technically the correct response to a joke and was, in its texture, precisely wrong. It was laugh-shaped. It occupied the right duration, and something in its production was different from the laugh Ron had heard in the cold corridor in first year, different from Harry's laughter at the chess games, different from the sound Harry had made the time George's puking pastille went off at the wrong end of the table. Ron filed this away. He did not mention it. Item 2. Hermione explaining a defensive spell to Neville in the corridor outside Defense Against the Dark Arts. She was patient. She was always patient with Neville, who needed things offered more than once in more than one register before they settled. At a certain point she said, "You're doing well," and the words were correct, and the sentiment was correct, and something in the delivery had the quality of a very good translation that has lost the original music. She had said it the way a manual explains what a compliment is. Neville didn't notice. Ron noticed. He began, around the 3rd week of October, to grieve. He could not have named what he was grieving for because he could not precisely name what he had, only that he had it and that he had known since first year that it was unusual, and that it was receding the way tides recede, gradually, without drama, in the way of something following its own schedule rather than anyone's preference. They were becoming more themselves, which was, Ron understood without being able to fully articulate the problem. October. After Quidditch practice, Ron came off the pitch cold and muddy, and in the specific mood that followed a session where he had saved 4 out of 7 attempts and could not decide whether to be proud of the 4 or furious about the 3. He changed in the locker room without showering and found Harry in the empty classroom they had used for quiet conversation since 2nd year. He had rehearsed this. 3 weeks of rehearsal, a speech with actual structure, acknowledgement of the situation, specific observed examples, a clear articulation of what he needed, and an ending that did not involve anyone crying, which was ambitious, but which Ron considered achievable if he kept his voice level. He got approximately 2 sentences into it. Then he punched Harry in the shoulder. Not hard. He had used perhaps a fifth of the force he would deploy in a genuine altercation, of which he had had several with his brothers and knew the calibration for. This was not that. This was a different kind of force entirely, the kind that says, "I am here, you are here, we are in this room together, and I need you to be in this room with me." Harry's face did the thing. It was a small thing, the kind that happens in the half-second between a surprise arriving and the mind reaching the body to manage the response. The slight widening of the eyes, the hand coming up to the shoulder, the unguarded quality of a person who did not see it coming and has not yet had time to decide how to receive it. Harry Potter, who had stood in a graveyard while the most feared dark wizard of the age raised his wand and had not flinched, who had looked at Dementors without going cold, Harry Potter made the small, surprised face of someone who just got punched in the shoulder by his friend. Ron said, "There you are." Harry laughed. It was short. It was surprised. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds and had in it no performance, no consideration, no shape selected from the available options. It was entirely itself, which was the thing, which was the whole thing, which was what Ron had been keeping his list for. He sat down on one of the classroom desks and did not say anything else for a moment. He did not need to. Harry's hand was still on his shoulder. His expression had settled into something Ron did not have a precise word for. Not sheepishness, not relief, but the particular quality of someone who has just been found doing something they did not know they needed to be found doing. "I've been," Harry started. "I know," Ron said. "It's fine. It's not, though." "No, but it's fixable." Ron turned a piece of chalk over in his hands. "You don't have to be different when you're with me. That's the whole thing. That's all I needed you to know." Harry was quiet. The classroom held its quiet with him. "I'm going to try to get better at this," he said. "I know you are," Ron said. "You always do." This was Ron Weasley's power. It was not a power anyone recognized, including Ron. He was not the most magically gifted of the 3. He knew this, had made peace with it in the quiet way of people who have sat beside brilliance long enough to understand its dimensions clearly. He could not read souls. He could not stop killing curses. He could not commune with basilisks or audit a Dark Lord's violations of the natural order. His power was presence, the specific, unglamorous, renewable act of showing up repeatedly and with full attention for 2 people who could do things the wizarding world did not have language for and who still needed, occasionally, to be punched in the shoulder by someone who gave a damn. His power was making sure they remembered what Bertie Bott's vomit flavor tasted like. His power was caring whether they remembered. He used this power perhaps twice more in the remaining years. Both times it worked. The novel was a Muggle detective story, a battered paperback Ron had borrowed from his father's collection, its cover featuring a country house, and the sort of fog that British mystery fiction considered indispensable, which he had read over a weekend and found troubling in a way he had not expected and could not quite account for. He left it on Hermione's desk without comment. No note, no explanation, just the book face down, precisely placed, which was, he thought, the register she would best understand. She read it in a single evening. He knew this because she found him at breakfast the following morning before he had finished pouring his pumpkin juice. She sat down across from him with the contained energy of someone who has been holding an argument since approximately 2 a.m. and has reached the limit of what containment will accommodate. "The ending doesn't make sense," she said, without preamble and without greeting, which was Hermione when something had genuinely engaged her. The detective identifies the cousin as the killer on the basis of the solicitor's testimony, but the solicitor's testimony places the cousin in Edinburgh on the night in question. The detective simply ignores this, which means either the solicitor is lying, in which case the detective needs to establish that, and the text never does, or the detective's conclusion rests on evidence that directly contradicts the only verified alibi in the case, which is either a deliberate misdirection the author fails to explain, or a structural error that undermines the entire internal logic of. Ron listened to all 14 minutes of it. He had not timed this. He knew it was 14 minutes because Hermione told him afterward, with the particular satisfaction she reserved for things she had calculated correctly. He listened because he had specifically sat down with extra time before his first class, and because Hermione in full argument was a specific register he had missed without being able to name what he was missing, and because it was important that she know someone was listening. At the end of the 14 minutes, Ron said, "That's what I thought too." Hermione looked at him. Something in her face did the small thing that it hadn't done in a while, the thing that was not cataloging, not filing, not the expression of someone processing information correctly, but simply the expression of a person who is having a conversation they did not know they needed, and are only now recognizing that they needed it. "Thank you for the book," she said. Ron refilled his pumpkin juice. "There are more if you want them." "I want them." They ate breakfast. Around them the hall had its morning texture, the accumulated noise of several hundred students in various states of readiness. Umbridge's newest educational decree on the notice board, by the entrance where no one was reading it because they had all read the previous 7 and had developed the habit of not giving them the attention they were designed to extract. The school was the school it had always been, with its old stone and its moving staircases and the cold corridor on the 3rd floor that Harry and Hermione occupied, and that Ron visited with enough frequency that the portraits along it had started nodding at him. The fact of that had not changed. He was going to make sure the fact of that did not change. Umbridge's formal student interviews were scheduled across November, alphabetical by house, 20 minutes per appointment. She had framed these as academic progress reviews under the educational decree currently numbered above 40. The framing was technically accurate in the way that certain things are technically accurate. Harry attended his on a Wednesday at 4 o'clock. He answered her first 3 questions with accuracy and precision. His progress in the approved curriculum, his assessment of current teaching standards, his observations of the educational environment as it stood this year. Umbridge wrote things down. Her smile maintained its structural integrity throughout. The 4th question was the one she had organized the interview to reach. It was carefully worded. Several days of careful wording had gone into it, and designed to elicit, through a sequence of nested premises, confirmation that the Ministry's official position on Voldemort's non-return was correct, and that Harry's previous public claims to the contrary had been the result of confusion, or, as the phrasing went, undue personal distress, following a traumatic experience. Harry said, "Voldemort has returned. He is not fully active because his account is incomplete. When it is complete, we will collect him." He held her gaze with the undramatic steadiness of someone conveying established fact. "This is not a matter of ministry position." Umbridge's pen stopped moving. She opened her mouth. She had prepared for resistance. She had a hierarchy of responses organized by level of resistance anticipated, each designed to redirect toward the ministry's preferred conclusion through a different route. Harry said, and the not unkindly was specific, was the register of someone delivering information rather than performing anything. "You should know, Professor, that your own account is not without outstanding entries." The interview concluded. Umbridge sat alone in the classroom she had commandeered for the purpose. On the desk, her form with 4 questions answered, her hierarchy of responses undeployed, her pen uncapped, the pink cardigan, the smile which had held through most of the afternoon with the reliability of something well practiced, and which was, in the absence of an audience, in the process of no longer holding. She wrote something in the margin of the form. She crossed it out. She wrote something else, considered it, and then put the pen down entirely and looked at the wall for a while in the way of someone doing arithmetic in a currency they had not previously used. Outside the classroom window, the November grounds were dark by 4:30, and the first frost of the year was already settling across the castle lawn, and the lights in the Gryffindor tower were warm from a distance, and somewhere in a third-floor corridor that had been cold since September, 2 doors stood closed against the dark, as they always did. The vision arrived in June, in the specific hour between 3 and 4 in the morning, when sleep is thinnest and the mind's defenses operate at their minimum. Harry saw Sirius in the Department of Mysteries. He saw the corridor lined with glowing prophecy orbs, the particular architecture of that place, and Sirius, captive, hurt, held by Voldemort's design in a location that was also, notably, the location where the veil was kept. He lay awake for 20 minutes afterward. The vision had the quality of something constructed rather than witnessed. The Sirius in it moved with a slight delay, assembled from available information rather than from observation. Harry had read Sirius's soul once, lightly, in the careful way he used for people he loved, enough to know its signature, not enough to violate it. The soul in the vision was a reproduction, accurate in outline, wrong in the particular gravity of how Sirius Orion Black occupied space. Voldemort had built it from knowledge rather than from sight. Harry dressed in the dark. He found Hermione already awake in the common room, which was not surprising. "It's false," he said. "I know," Hermione said, "but he wants us there." "Yes." She closed her book, "which means there's something in the Department of Mysteries that he wants, and he's arranged for us to be present when he tries to take it." She looked at him. "We should go. We should bring people." They brought Ron, Neville, Ginny, and Luna. Luna, who had never been asked to do anything like this before, said yes without hesitation, in the particular way of someone who finds the invitation more comprehensible than the people extending it expect. The Department of Mysteries, June 1996. The ministry was quiet at midnight. The atrium felt vast and vacated, the golden fountain's water moving in the dark, the fireplaces cold. They moved through it with the directness of people who have a destination and have prepared for it. And the ministry's impressive security systems, designed to prevent entry from outside, had considerably less to say about individuals who moved through buildings the way Harry and Hermione moved through things. The Department of Mysteries was below. The circular room with its identical doors. The time room, its clocks measuring intervals that were not hours. The brain room, which they moved through quickly because what lived in the tanks was old, and Harry could feel it registering his presence with an attention he preferred not to linger in. The planet room, the love chamber, always sealed, its power so concentrated that warmth radiated through the door itself. Then the death chamber. Harry heard it before they entered. Not a sound exactly, the specific shape of an absence, the way a door that is ajar sounds different from a door that is closed. He had known this room since first year, had carried its presence in the back of his awareness, the way you carry the knowledge of a window even when you are not looking at it. The Death Eaters were already inside. 12 of them, arranged across the chamber's tiered seating with the precise positioning of people who were told where to stand and followed instructions carefully. Lucius Malfoy, Antonin Dolohov, Rodolphus Lestrange. Others Harry recognized from file and face. Bellatrix Lestrange at the center, with the specific quality she always carried of someone for whom this was exactly the right sort of evening. Ron and Neville and Ginny and Luna came to a stop at the chamber's entrance. Harry and Hermione walked down the tiered steps toward the veil. "Brave," Bellatrix said. From across the chamber, her voice held genuine admiration, which was in some ways worse than contempt. Or stupid. "We've had this debate before." Harry and Hermione did not respond. They reached the floor of the chamber. The stone arch rose before them, ancient and unhurried, the curtain moving in its endless private wind. Harry could hear voices. He always could hear. He did not enumerate them. This was the private thing, the thing he did not report and did not speak of, not even to Hermione. One voice he knew. He had never heard it in life. He knew it anyway, the way you know a piece of music described to you rather than taught. From inheritance, from the specific shape of an absence that has been present long enough to take on a form. He did not speak to it. He reached out and parted the curtain. not violently. The way you open a door you've opened 1,000 times, your hand finding the familiar place, the familiar resistance, the familiar feeling of a boundary giving way. The curtain parted. The light that bled through was silver gray and tremendously calm. The light of a place that was not interested in being dramatic about its own existence. The light of a deep archive where things rest after they have finished being other things. Harry said, through the veil, in the language beneath language, "We have need of witnesses." What came through were not in fury. They were not enslaved, not compelled, not controlled, not brought back through any mechanism that took without asking. They were souls who had completed their crossing and were at rest in the void, who had been asked and had agreed, and the distinction between being summoned and being invited was the entire moral distance between dark necromancy and the old rites, and that distance was the whole reason what happened next could happen at all. Emmeline Vance, who had died at a Death Eater ambush 7 months prior. Broderick Bode, who had died in St. Mungo's with the devil's snare on his chest and no satisfactory explanation on the official record. Marlene McKinnon, who had been killed with her entire family in 1981 and who had been waiting with the patience of completed things for this particular moment. 6 others, their names known to the order, to buried ministry records, to the families who had been encouraged to stop asking questions. They did not glow, they did not float, they were presences, recognizable, clear-eyed, occupying the chamber with the quality of people who have nothing left to pretend and therefore no longer pretend. They looked around the tiered seating with the complete knowledge of people who have finished an experience and are examining it from the other side. The Death Eaters, who had organized their lives around Voldemort's fantasy of conquering death, who had taken the dark mark on the premise that their master's immortality was real and transferable, who had killed and tortured and broken families on the assurance that what they were building was permanent, discovered that the dead had not transcended anything. The dead were here. The dead were patient. The dead were with the specific thoroughness of people who now knew everything, entirely unimpressed. The Death Eaters could not move, not from any binding curse, not from any physical restraint. From the weight of being witnessed, being seen by the people they had killed with the full and unmediated clarity of what those people now knew about them, about what their choices had produced, about what the world looked like from the other side of those choices. Dolahov's wand hand stopped being a wand hand. Lucius Malfoy, who had spent 30 years constructing the impression of a man who could not be touched, stood very still and could not construct anything at all. Bellatrix Lestrange kept her wand raised. She was the strongest among them, the most committed, the truest believer, and what she believed was genuinely believed, which meant it had weight behind it, and did not dissolve simply because the situation had changed. She faced Harry across the stone floor with the conviction of someone whose certainty has been tested before and has survived the testing. "You have no idea," she said, "what you're doing." "You killed Sirius Black's mother," he said. His voice was level, factual, the register of someone reading from a record. "She is one of the witnesses." A pause. "She would like a word." Not forward, there was no aggression in it, no confrontation in any form the word was built to describe. Simply toward Bellatrix. Walburga Black, who had died the year before, who had raised Bellatrix's husband in this tradition, who had known Bellatrix since her childhood, who now knew with the completeness that the crossing provides everything she had previously only suspected, looked at her niece by marriage. Bellatrix Lestrange's wand dropped. She did not choose to drop it. She found that she was no longer holding it. The way you find you are no longer standing when your legs have made a decision the rest of you has not caught up with yet. On the upper tier, Hermione had been watching Sirius. She had kept one part of her attention on him since they entered. Not the full read, not the cataloging, but the peripheral awareness she maintained for people she cared about and had specific concerns about. She had read enough of his soul over the years to know the shape of what lived in its deepest layer. A death wish he had not named, which was different from a wish to die but occupied adjacent territory. The quality of a man who had stopped being fully convinced that his continued presence in the world was a net good, and who had organized his behavior around that unconvincing instead of acknowledging it. She had seen him moving toward the veil when the curtain first parted. Not rushing, not dramatically, moving with the quality of something being drawn rather than pushed. The specific motion of a person answering a question they had been carrying for a long time without knowing they were carrying it. She stepped into his path without fanfare. She did not explain. She did not make a speech about it. She stood between Sirius Black and the veil and looked at him with the quality of someone who has read a soul and is not going to perform ignorance of what she found. Sirius stopped. He looked at her. Something moved through his face that he did not have language for. Which was itself information? Sirius Black was a man who had language for most things and deployed it readily, and its absence here said something about how close to the wordless the moment was. "Not today," Hermione said quietly. The 3 words were the same 3 words she had said to Voldemort in a graveyard. They meant something completely different in this room, which was a measure of how much ground the phrase covered. Sirius sat down on the stone steps. He sat there for a long time while the chamber held its configuration around him. The redeemed in their positions, the Death Eaters remaining still, Harry before the veil with its curtain moving behind him, the silver-gray light holding steady. He was alive. He would be alive at the end of this evening, and the evening after, and he would return to Grimmauld Place and spend the following months writing letters to Harry and Hermione with the slightly effortful quality of someone who has been given back a life they had slowly, without announcement, stopped valuing, and who is learning in the specific incremental way that unlearning works to find the value in it again. Cornelius Fudge arrived with his Aurors at 1:17 in the morning. He had a statement. He had prepared it in the lift down, in the specific urgency of a man who has been told something extraordinary is occurring and has determined that the most important thing is to ensure the official account is filed correctly before any competing account becomes established. The statement concerned ministry oversight of unauthorized soul magic events on government property, the legal frameworks governing the veil and its usage, the protocols that would need to be observed before this evening could be formally processed and attributed correctly. He walked into the death chamber. The statement did not complete its journey out of his mouth. The redeemed turned to look at him. They were not threatening. There was no hostile motion, no aggression, no demand. They simply turned, with the unified patience of people who have been waiting a long time for this particular moment and have sufficient time remaining to be calm about it, and they looked at Cornelius Fudge. They were the people the ministry had failed to protect, the people the ministry had failed to believe when belief would have made a difference, the people the ministry had failed to avenge, had discouraged the families of from asking questions about, had classified and filed and allowed to recede from public attention in the service of an institutional position that was, and had always been, incorrect. They looked at Cornelius Fudge with the full and unmediated weight of what they knew about him, about his choices, about what his choices had meant for them specifically. Fudge, who had maintained his position for years through mastery of the public statement, found that no statement he had prepared was built for this room. He said to his aide, in a voice considerably quieter than the one he had used in the lift, "We will be making a public statement, acknowledging you know whose return." His aide wrote this down. Fudge looked at the chamber, at the presences within it, at Harry and Hermione standing before the veil with the curtain moving behind them at its own private pace, at the Death Eaters being removed one by ministry Aurors, each departure requiring more care than anticipated, because the capacity for voluntary motion appeared to be returning to them only gradually. And perhaps, Fudge said, a review of the ministry's handling of the past several years. His aide wrote this down too, with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned not to let their handwriting express an opinion. The redeemed had begun to recede, returning the way they came, without drama, in the way that things return home when the purpose that brought them forward has been accomplished. The silver-gray light at the parted curtain dimmed to its ordinary level. The curtain settled back into its unceasing movement. The death chamber was quiet. On the stone steps, Sirius Black sat with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and his breathing was the breathing of someone still learning to be glad about it. Hermione found Snape in his classroom at 10:30 on a Tuesday in November, grading third-year essays with the specific economy of a man who has made contempt efficient. She did not knock. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the chair students occupied when they were in sufficient trouble to be brought here individually, which Hermione Granger had never been in 6 years, because she had never given him the particular kind of trouble that required private accounting. He did not look up from the essay. "Miss Granger." "Professor." She folded her hands on the desk in front of her with the quality of someone who has prepared for a conversation and is ready to begin it. "Your account with Lily Potter is settled." He had spent 30 years perfecting disdain into a form so complete and so practiced that it had become, for most situations, automatic, a first response that served as both armor and instrument. The default configuration of a man who had decided very early that vulnerability was expensive and had not revised this position across several decades of accumulated evidence that the decision was correct. He deployed it now with the full force of long practice. "I beg your pardon," he said in the voice reserved for maximum effect. "She has completed her crossing," Hermione said. Her voice was even, precise, carrying no sentiment she had not placed there deliberately. "She knows what you did, both the good and the terrible, the protection, the spying, the choices that cost you, and the choices that cost other people." A pause. "She does not blame you. She asks that you stop." "Stop," he said. The word came out carefully, as if testing whether it would hold weight. "Haunting," Hermione said. "You are not alive, Professor. You are a ghost who has not yet noticed he's died." She looked at him with the focused attention that was, at its most precise, not unkind. "You have been standing in 1981 for 25 years. The world has moved. She has moved. You are the only thing in this arrangement that is still." Snape said nothing. The classroom was quiet in the way of rooms where something significant has just been said, and the air has not yet determined how to reorganize itself around it. The candles on his desk produced their light. The shadows were deep. The essays stacked beside his quill looked like the accumulated documentation of a tenure that had been extended past its intended end date. Hermione reached into her robe and placed a small piece of paper on his desk. It was not ministry parchment, not Hogwarts stationery. It was small and ordinary, the kind of paper found in any household, in any drawer. The handwriting on it was not Hermione's. Snape looked at it for a long time without touching it. "Where did this come from?" he said finally. "You know where it came from," Hermione said. She stood. She did not explain further. There was nothing further to explain, and she was not in the habit of explaining things twice to people who did not require it, and Severus Snape had never in his life required anything said twice. She left. Snape sat in his classroom with the note on the desk. The candles continued their work. The essays remained in their stack. The note said, "Go on." L. 2 words and an initial. He read them several times in the specific way of someone who understands that brevity is not the same as insufficiency. Then he folded the note along its original crease and placed it in the inner pocket of his robe, which was where he kept things he was not yet prepared to put down. He did not become a different person. He was still difficult, still exacting in the way of someone for whom precision was both a discipline and a method of maintaining distance. He still gave points with reluctance and removed them with efficiency, still swept into rooms with the momentum of someone who has decided that presence can substitute for power when deployed at the correct angle. But the weight began to lift, not all at once, gradually in the way that ice lifts from a river. Not melting, but loosening, the grip releasing by degrees as something changed in the temperature of his daily existence. He began to protect Harry and Hermione with the full commitment of a man who has, finally, after decades of avengement, something to protect instead. He became not a friend. He was constitutionally incapable of friendship in any conventional sense, and no one who knew him had ever expected otherwise, but an ally. Sharp and difficult and, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely present in his own life rather than standing sentinel over someone else's ended one. Draco Malfoy deteriorated through year 6 in the specific way of someone performing a version of themselves that does not fit, and who has run out of room to avoid the performance any further. Harry and Hermione observed this. They had known about the assignments since September, not through Dumbledore, not through Order intelligence, but through the straightforward mechanism of Hermione having briefly read Draco's soul in 5th year and noted, among other things, the specific texture of something being required of him that was not yet concrete but was taking shape. She had added it to her notebook and checked it periodically. By October it was concrete. They did not tell Dumbledore. Dumbledore had his own knowledge of his situation. They had confirmed this through the inference available to people who can read what someone is carrying without being told about it. And he was managing toward an ending according to a plan he had constructed with care. Interfering with a man's chosen conclusion was not within their mandate unless asked, and they had not been asked. They watched Draco instead. What they watched was not evil. Evil was the word the wizarding world used for people who chose darkness deliberately and with relish, and Draco Malfoy was not doing that. What he was doing was something more precise and more tragic. He was a person whose capacity for genuine choice had been so thoroughly managed by his parents, by his formation, by the world he had been handed as a child and told was both natural and inevitable, that when the moment arrived requiring a real choice he could not locate the mechanism. He had never been permitted to develop it. It had not occurred to anyone around him that this was something a person needed until he was 16 years old and the need for it was immediate. He could not do what he had been asked to do. He could not do it in October when he had time. He could not do it in January, when the pressure increased. He could not do it in March, when Hermione found him in the corridor outside the astronomy tower at 11 in the evening, standing very still with the specific quality of someone trying to convince themselves of something they cannot convince themselves of. She stopped. "You're being asked to do something you cannot do," she said. Draco looked at her with the expression of someone who had been expecting a threat and encountered something else entirely. "That is not weakness," she said. "That is information about who you are." A pause in which the corridor held its old stone quiet. "What you do with that information is still your choice." She walked on. Draco stood in the corridor for a long time. By the time one of the Slytherin prefects came looking for him, his face had settled into a configuration that was not resolve. He did not have access to resolve in any clean form, but was the specific configuration of someone who has just understood something they cannot understand, and who is learning in real time what that means for what comes next. The night Dumbledore died, Draco stood on the astronomy tower with his wand raised and 5 Death Eaters at his back, and a man across from him who had lived 115 years, and had chosen, with the particular care of someone who has spent a lifetime thinking about choices, exactly how those years would end. Draco could not pull the trigger. He had known he couldn't. Some part of him had known since March, since the corridor, since a sentence that had been offered not as mercy but as information, and which had settled into him and stayed there. The Death Eaters at his back could feel it. The wand arm that would not follow the instruction, the boy who had been sent to do a thing and was standing in front of the thing and discovering that the distance between the two was insurmountable. Dumbledore looked at him, not with judgment, not with fear, with the patient recognition of a man who had read the situation correctly and was waiting for the final movement to unfold on the schedule he had designed for it months ago in a conversation with the only other person present who had known this was coming. Snape stepped forward. What happened next was between Snape and Dumbledore and the plan they had made together, and it was terrible and deliberate, and the specific kind of mercy that looks nothing like mercy from the outside. The tower was very high. The night was very clear. Draco Malfoy did not kill Albus Dumbledore, which was the whole of what he managed, and was also, in ways he would not understand for years, the only thing he did that night that truly belonged to him. The Death Eaters were in the castle. They had come through during the chaos of the tower. Greyback among them because Greyback went where violence was available, and the castle had violence tonight. He moved through the corridors with the ease of something that has been waiting for this specific kind of evening for a long time, following the sounds of fighting with the purposefulness of a predator reading signals it has spent decades learning. He found Harry in a side corridor near the library. He was pleased by this. He was a man who appreciated clarity, and this was clear. Harry Potter alone in a corridor, while the school sorted itself out around them. He took his time. He explained in some detail what he was, and what he preferred and the nature of what he chose to do when circumstances permitted it. He had delivered similar speeches before, and found them useful as a preliminary. They established the terms. They ensured that what followed was understood correctly by both parties. Harry stood very still through all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not show fear. He watched Greyback with the complete attention he brought to everything. The attention of someone cataloging rather than experiencing, noting the 17 entries he already had filed and confirmed against what he was hearing now. When Greyback finished, Harry said, "Fenrir Greyback." Greyback stopped smiling. 17 outstanding entries in the ledger, 12 of them are children. Harry tilted his head slightly, the small motion he made when delivering specific information to a specific recipient. "You will not harm anyone else tonight." The quality of the air in the corridor changed, not dramatically, not with any of the indicators that wizarding confrontations usually produced. The stones were the same stones, the corridor was the same corridor, and the air had the quality of a room when the door opens onto somewhere much colder than the room. Not the desperate cold of a Dementor, but the quiet cold of something enormous that has existed at a very large scale for a very long time, and has just directed its full attention to a specific and very small location. Fenrir Greyback had not feared anyone since the night he was bitten at age 5. He had processed that night as a beginning rather than a damage, had taken the transformation it produced and built a self around it, had spent 40 years being the thing in the dark that other things feared. He had not maintained a category for what it felt like to be found by something that outclassed him. The category opened now. It felt like recognition, like something old and enormous had just noticed him. Not casually, not peripherally, but with the specific and complete attention of something reading his name from a very long record in very permanent ink. He felt the weight of that attention the way you feel a sound you cannot hear, as pressure rather than noise. He ran. He did not decide to run. He was simply running, which is a distinction that matters. He did not stop for several miles. The sensation did not diminish with distance the way ordinary fear diminishes with distance, because it was not tracking him. It simply knew where he was, and the knowing did not constitute escape. 3 days later, oars caught him in a village near Bristol. He had been moving erratically, which they interpreted as evidence of routes being changed and plans being adjusted. A reasonable reading of the available evidence. He told them nothing about why he was already running when they caught him. He had no language for it, which was, in itself, the most comprehensive aspect of the whole experience, that there was a kind of being found that he had no category for, and no way to build one retroactively, and no way to explain to anyone in any available vocabulary what it had felt like to stand in a corridor and have something look at him and simply say, "Not tonight," and mean it in a register that was not arguable. The 7th year had no fixed point. The 6 years before it had Hogwarts, the castle, the cold corridor, Ron with his plates of food, the rhythm of classes and meals, and the slow accumulation of what they needed to know. The 7th year was movement, following the Horcrux trail across Britain with the specific focus of people who understand that each step in a sequence has a purpose and that the sequence cannot be rushed but must not stop. The locket they found in a cave on the Scottish coast in November, in a basin of dark water designed to extract a cost from anyone who reached for it. They did not pay the cost. Harry could feel the Horcrux from 100 yards offshore, the familiar gray luminescence behind his scar, pointing like a compass that had only one direction, and they approached it without illusion about what it was or what they were going to do with it. The recall was quiet. Hermione placed the locket at the threshold. Not a physical threshold, but the specific point of contact between the mortal world and the void's attention, which she could locate with the precision of someone trained to find it. And Harry asked the fragment inside what the protocol required. "Do you want to continue?" The fragment could not answer. It was a piece of a man who had spent decades systematically removing from himself everything that could be called the capacity for answering. It was examined. It was recalled to the ledger. It went not back to Voldemort, but into the record, which was where all accounts eventually resided. The cup came from Gringotts in December, retrieved through a combination of Harry's authority over the Goblin's older affiliations and Hermione's exhaustive research into the bank's security architecture. The Goblins raised their eyebrows. Goblin eyebrows contain a great deal of expressiveness for a small amount of hair, and stood aside. The diadem was in the room of requirement, buried in 1,000 years of lost things. They found it in an hour. Each recall followed the same protocol. Each fragment was the same, a piece of something that had forgotten how to be anything, examined with care and returned to the record with the thoroughness of people who do not leave accounts outstanding when they have the means to close them. May 1998. Hogwarts. Nagini was last among the external Horcruxes. The last one of all lived in Harry's scar, and that required a different agreement and a different kind of preparation. But first, the snake. The Battle of Hogwarts began at nightfall. The Order, the DA, the castle's own defensive magic responding to the assault on its wards, the grounds became a battlefield with the quality of places where what is being fought over matters more than the fighting itself. The castle's walls took damage they had not sustained in centuries. Giants at the perimeter, acromantulas from the forest. The corridors lit with spellfire. Harry moved through it with his attention divided. The battle around him managed with the defensive competence of someone who has been preparing for this specifically for 7 years. And in the other part, the part that ran beneath all of it, Nagini. She was close to Voldemort always. That was the design. Keep the last external Horcrux within reach. The last anchor, the last insurance against whatever came. Harry had known this and had planned around it. He found her in the corridor outside the Great Hall, separated from Voldemort by 50 feet, and the intervention of a doorway, which was more separation than he had seen between them all night. He crouched. He spoke to her in the deep register, the language beneath parcel tongue, the one that did not issue commands but made the older kind of contact, the kind that required honesty and moved at the level where deception was not architecturally possible. He said, "There is something inside you that is not yours. It was placed there without your consent. I can separate it from you. It will not hurt you. What is yours will remain." Nagini was very old. She had been changed by the Horcrux's long tenancy and by decades of dark magic saturating her environment. She was not as she had been before either, but she was still a snake. She still had the snake's deep reading of what stood before her. She lowered her head. Hermione performed the separation. What came out of Nagini was not visible in any conventional sense. A change in the air around the snake, a lightening the specific texture of something that had been compressed for years, releasing into its correct dimensions. The fragment was recalled. The record received it. Harry looked at the snake. In the language beneath language, I am sorry for the years of it. You may go. Nagini went. Into the castle's shadows. Toward the grounds. Toward whatever remained of her own nature now that it no longer shared space with a piece of a stolen and ruined soul. He found Voldemort in the corridor 20 minutes later. Voldemort looked at him with the red eyes and the complete certainty of someone who has done his accounting and believes he is ahead. He did not know yet that Nagini was gone. He did not know the locket, or the cup, or the diadem were recalled. He believed he had anchors remaining, and he was wrong on every count, which was the final iteration of the error he had been making since 1981. Harry Potter, Voldemort said, you've come to die. I've come to finish it, Harry said. Which was, strictly speaking, the same thing from a certain angle. He stepped forward without raising his wand, and Voldemort, who had misread every significant interaction they had ever had, who had never once correctly understood what Harry Potter was, raised the Elder Wand and cast. The killing curse took Harry to the void. He had been here before, many times, in the partial way that the void's children were always partly here, carrying its cold, its stillness, its sense of depth beneath everything in the mortal world. This was simply more of it, the full version rather than the habitual faint signal. The quarantine box was where it had always been, the contained thing, the small, cold, separate presence that had been kept from spreading into him for 16 years by his father's maintenance. Harry stood in the void and looked at it, and did not hurry. This was not a place where hurry had meaning. He opened it. The fragment of Voldemort's soul inside was exposed to the full light of the void, and the void does not illuminate the way sunlight illuminates, warmly, gradually, with shadow. The void illuminates the way the complete is not partial, the way the total is not approximate. The fragment, which had always been the smallest and most desperate of the pieces, the part left behind when a soul has been divided too many times for any of the pieces to retain the structural integrity of something that can endure, did not survive the exposure. It did not last long. There was not much of it left to last. Death collected it. Harry returned, which was less of a journey than a simple adjustment of conditions. He was in the void, and then the conditions that had placed him there were no longer operative, and so he was not. The mortal world re-established itself around him, with the matter-of-fact quality of things that do not require fanfare to be real. He was on the stone floor of the corridor. He stood up. The Great Hall. The same night, Voldemort was waiting in the ruins of the hall. He had the Elder Wand which he had taken from Dumbledore's tomb in the certainty that it would make him the most powerful wizard alive. He was not wrong about the wand's power. He was wrong about what power was for, and wrong about whose power it was, which were the two errors that had been at the root of everything from the beginning, and had never been corrected because he had never built a mechanism for correcting errors. The wand performed for him only what it must. It had performed for every caretaker only what it must. The long line of temporary custodians across 4 centuries, each of them holding it without being its rightful owner, each accessing a fraction of its actual capacity. For Harry, the wand had been waiting since the first time his hand had closed around it, and it had recognized what he was. What followed was brief. Not because Harry was more powerful in any direct competitive sense. Power in that measuring was not the relevant metric. There was nothing left to contest. A soul without any remaining anchors, without any protection against the natural order, standing in front of the natural order's appointed heirs. It was not a fight. It was a conclusion being permitted to conclude. Voldemort's final killing curse left his wand, the Elder Wand, from across the ruins of the hall, from Harry's direction, returning to him across the space between them with the certainty of something that has known where it belongs for longer than anyone in the room had been alive, reached through the air and took the curse apart, not deflected, not countered, disassembled piece by piece, with the quiet thoroughness of a very old debt being finally settled by the party that owed it. Tom Marvolo Riddle died, what remained of his soul, reduced by decades of deliberate fragmentation to almost nothing, to the final remnant of a man who had spent the better part of a lifetime systematically dismantling himself in the belief that the dismantling would preserve him, was collected by death and placed in the ledger. It was one of the shortest entries in the record, A man who had wanted to live forever had arrived at mortality with nothing but the account of the running. The entry took very little space. The record noted his name, his dates, the sum of his choices, and what those choices had produced. And the notation was brief because what he had become by the end was brief. A remainder, a residue, the specific nothing that is left when a person has spent everything they were on, the avoidance of the only thing that is guaranteed. The hall was very quiet. Outside, the battle was ending in stages, in the way that things end when the center they were organized around is gone. Dolores Umbridge was in the entrance hall. She had been there throughout the later part of the battle, which was the optimal position for someone who had been coordinating with Voldemort's Ministry faction, and who had, upon determining that the faction was losing, made the assessment that the entrance hall was the correct location to demonstrate that she had always been a neutral party to events. She still had her clipboard. She had maintained it through the entire evening with the tenacity of someone who believes that the clipboard confers a status the battle's outcome cannot revoke. Harry found her there. He said, "Dolores Jane Umbridge." She opened her mouth. "Your account with this establishment," Harry said, "with the Ministry of Magic, with the Centaur Nation, with the students you tortured, with the Muggle-borns you prosecuted, these are all recorded." He looked at her with the complete attention of someone consulting a record that has been kept with care for a very long time. "You will go with the Aurors now. Every entry in your account will be verified in public proceedings." A pause. "We recommend truthfulness. It tends to go better." Umbridge went with the Aurors. She was, at her trial, characteristically resistant for approximately 6 hours. Her legal representation was well prepared. Her demeanor was composed. She had made the management of accountability into a refined skill across a long career, and she brought that skill to her defense with the full commitment of someone for whom being held responsible has always been a problem to be administered rather than accepted. Then Hermione Granger was called as a witness. She read aloud from the ledger. The reading took 47 minutes. It was thorough in the way that Hermione's everything was thorough. Every entry verified, every incident dated, every victim named where a name was available and described with precision where it was not. It covered the students and the centaurs and the Muggle-borns, and the ministry subordinates she had used and the officials she had threatened, and the laws she had bent past their structural integrity, and the ones she had simply broken when bending was less convenient. It covered the blood quill. It covered the Dementor deployment against a minor. It covered the Muggle-born Registration Commission. It covered everything, because the ledger covered everything, because the ledger was kept by people who understood that everything was not a figure of speech. Dolores Umbridge did not interrupt it. She sat for 47 minutes in the trial chamber and did not speak, because the ledger was not a document that invited response. It was a record. It had been kept with the care that all records in the natural order were kept, completely, accurately, without revision for convenience, without gaps where the inconvenient things had been. When Hermione finished, Umbridge's legal representation made several sounds that were not quite arguments and did not function as arguments because they were not built on anything that the ledger had left standing. The Wizengamot voted. The world after the Battle of Hogwarts was not a different world. The battle stopped, which was important, and Voldemort was gone, which was the thing that had been necessary for so long that the wizarding world had organized most of its anxiety around it. But the Ministry was still the Ministry. Its forms and debates and slow institutional memory intact, its tendency to learn the most recent lesson while forgetting the previous 9 uninterrupted. The arguments about Muggle-born integration continued. The House Elf rights movement continued. Quidditch controversies continued. This was correct. This was the mortal world doing what mortal worlds do, moving forward at the pace that mortal things move, which is neither fast enough nor slow enough, but is the speed at which permanent change actually happens, when it happens for real. Minerva McGonagall became headmistress of Hogwarts, with the particular energy of a woman who has been waiting for a specific opportunity for years and greets its arrival without unnecessary ceremony. She was excellent at it. She would always have been excellent at it. The school responded to her the way the school responded to people who understood what it was for. Severus Snape was seen, the morning after the battle, walking toward the castle's main gate with a single bag and no stated destination. He was not heading toward Hogwarts. He was not heading toward London. He was heading somewhere that was, for the first time in 30 years, entirely his own choice. His stride had the quality of someone who has received permission from themselves to move forward. No one followed him. He did not look back. The portrait of Albus Dumbledore appeared in the headmistress's office 3 weeks after the battle, installed by the house elves with the care they brought to anything that mattered. Harry and Hermione visited it once. The painted eyes were blue, which was accurate, and they had more in them than paint, which was also accurate because portraits carried what they carried, and what they most carried was the quality of the original's attention pressed forward into pigment and enchantment and time. The portrait looked at them. Harry said, "You did what you thought was right. I did what I thought I could manage," the portrait said. Its voice had the quality of a thing that has been relieved of the need to perform confidence, and is, for the first time, simply being what it is. I was not always correct about what I could manage. The soft movements of silver instruments on their brackets, the slow breath of other portraits observing from their frames, with the circumspection of people who understand when a conversation is not for them. "I kept the Elder Wand," the portrait said. "For 50 years I kept it and told myself it was stewardship, told myself I was holding it until the right time, the right recipient, the right arrangement of circumstances." And after a while, Hermione said, "The telling became the believing." Yes, the portrait was quiet. "I am sorry for the time that cost you." Harry looked at the painted face, the half-moon spectacles, the long silver beard, the eyes that had watched him across 6 years of dinners and offices, and careful, considered interventions, and found that he had no anger left for it. The anger had been useful when it was useful. It was no longer useful. "You did prepare us," Harry said. "Not in the way you intended. But Hogwarts prepared us, the castle's response to our presence. The years of watching and being watched, the way the school organized itself around what we were." He looked at the portrait steadily. "That was yours." The portrait considered this for a long moment. Hermione said, "Your account with the Elder Wand is settled. We wanted you to know." The portrait was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the other portraits, who had been pretending to sleep, seemed to genuinely do so in the quality of the quiet. Then, "Thank you." They did not visit again. There was no need. The portrait was, in its way, at peace, which was a different thing from happiness, but was, at the portrait's particular stage of existence, the more appropriate thing to be. The Elder Wand went back to Dumbledore's tomb. Harry placed it there on a morning in June, alone. He sealed the tomb afterward with runic wards that Hermione had inscribed across 3 days. Permanent, unbreakable, the kind of wards that would outlast everyone currently alive and most things currently standing. The wand would stay there. This was correct. The wand had always accumulated the ambitions of its holders like sediment, and Harry had no ambition to add to the sediment, and he did not want power through dominance, which had been Antioch's curse and the curse of everyone who had held the wand since. And he had no interest in inheriting curses when he could simply choose not to. The resurrection stone he placed in a deep location in the north of Scotland, among granite and cold water and the kind of silence that predates human habitation. He did not discard it. It was too old and too real to be discarded, and there was something in him that felt the responsibility of its care even in its absence. He visited the location once a year. He sat beside the water. He did not turn the stone. He did not summon the dead that he could have summoned. This was the lesson of Cadmus, who had summoned and not survived the summoning, and Harry had no ambition to repeat it. The cloak stayed. It was folded in a wooden box in his room at Peverell Manor, and he wore it most mornings in the way that people wear their oldest and most familiar garment, not to make a statement, not to exercise a power, simply because it fit, and because it was his and because Ignotus Peverell had understood something that his brothers had not. The only mastery worth having is knowing when to put the power down. Wrap yourself in invisibility and simply live. Peverell Manor rebuilt itself in the Cotswolds over the course of one summer, on a hill that Muggle maps classified as uninteresting scrubland. It was not large by manor standards. 4 floors, 12 rooms, a library that was technically not contained within the building's stated dimensions, which was Hermione's doing and which she declined to apologize for. The kitchen Sirius had painted yellow within the first week of moving in, against all architectural advice, and the yellow persisted with the cheerful tenacity of something that knows it belongs there. He filled the corridor walls with photographs, wizarding and Muggle both, printed and framed and hung in no particular order of significance. James and Lily, young and laughing. Harry at various ages, with the reluctance of someone who has never learned how to be photographed. Hermione at a desk, not looking at the camera because something on the page was more interesting. Ron in multiple frames, wearing the specific expression he produced when he was about to object to something. Harry and Hermione moved in without announcement. They did not apply for ministry approval, which was just as well because the form for re-establishment of ancient magical seat had not been completed since 1403, and no one at the ministry's records office could confirm where it was currently filed. The house smelled of cold stone and old books, and something that was not quite incense and not quite winter, a smell that people who have come close to the void recognize immediately, and that everyone else found simply comfortable without being able to say why. Ron Weasley became the ambassador to the living. The position did not exist in any ministry charter. Harry and Hermione created it by saying it existed, which was sufficient. They had learned across 7 years of school and several years of aftermath that certain things become real in the mortal world through the simple act of being declared with enough certainty by the right people, and they were the right people for this particular declaration. His responsibilities were exactly what they sound like. He went between Peverell Manor and the mortal world, which was a journey of 40 minutes by broomstick, or considerably less by apparition. He brought news, what the ministry was doing, what the papers were saying, what Ginny was working on, what his mother had cooked and wanted Harry and Hermione to know they were welcome for. Always, no occasion required. He brought books for Hermione, who had developed the preferences of someone who has access to a very large library and has become proportionally more selective. He brought food, because Harry and Hermione still ate very little, and the gesture of bringing food anyway had become, over the years, its own language between the three of them. He brought, occasionally, people who needed to speak to them directly about outstanding accounts. He accompanied these people to the manor's sitting room and made tea while Harry and Hermione did their work because making tea was something he was good at, and because being present mattered even when you were not the one with the authority. And once a week, on Thursdays, because it had been a Thursday when he first knocked on that door in the cold corridor with a plate of food in 1991, and neither of them had ever suggested changing it. He played wizard chess with Harry in the manor's sitting room while Hermione read on the sofa. Harry defeated him in 6 moves. He had been defeating him in 6 moves since first year. The fact of this had not changed. Ron objected to each game's conclusion with the specific and renewable outrage of someone who has been losing the same game for 8 years and has not yet made peace with the losing, which was part of what made him Ron Weasley and part of what made the game worth playing. Hermione watched from the sofa and did not point out that Ron's strategy had not materially evolved since second year. This was not because she was unaware of it. It was because she had identified, at some point in the middle years, that she was fond of the game as it was, fond of Ron's objections and Harry's slight contained amusement and the specific rhythm of the pieces and the specific constancy of the result. Some things did not need to improve to be valuable. Some things were valuable precisely because they did not change. The Peverell mandate was fulfilled. The ledger was maintained. The threshold was held. The Veil had 2 acknowledged keepers who understood what they were and what they owed to the balance of things. And the balance was, for the first time in several centuries, actually balanced, not perfectly, not without the continuous small adjustments that balance requires, but held, maintained, real. The mortal world was still mortal. It made its mortal mistakes and mortal decisions, and had its mortal arguments about things that mattered and things that did not. The House Elf Rights legislation moved forward by increments. Muggle-born integration improved, slowly and imperfectly and genuinely. Quidditch continued to generate controversy with remarkable efficiency. Slow, difficult, genuine progress on all fronts, at the speed that genuine progress moves, which is the only speed that holds. This was correct. This was the mortal world being what it was, which was imperfect and irreplaceable and worth the keeping. Years later, the story does not specify how many, a wizard came to the hill in the Cotswolds. He was elderly, and he walked with the specific quality of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has arrived at last at the place where they believe they can put it down. He was frightened, which was visible in the careful way he placed his feet on the slope, and he was relieved, which was visible in the fact that he had come at all. He was carrying a small piece of stolen soul, not a Horcrux, nothing so deliberate or systematic as that. A mistake, a terrible decision made in a moment of desperation decades ago, the consequences of which he had not fully understood at the time, and had fully understood every day since. He had carried it through a long life of trying to deserve the carrying, of trying to be better than the decision, of being unable to put it down because he had not known where to bring it. He stood at the bottom of the hill and called out, not knowing if anyone would hear him, not entirely certain anyone was there. His voice went up the slope and reached the house at the top and was silent. The door opened. Harry Potter stood in the doorway. He was older, The years had left their marks, as years do, and he wore them without complaint, and unchanged in the essential ways, which were the ways that mattered. He was wearing the cloak around his shoulders with the naturalness of a coat, which was what it was, the most ancient garment of a very old family, worn the way Ignatus had worn it, which was easily and without theater. He looked down the hill at the old wizard. "Come in," he said. "We'll sort it out." The wizard walked up the hill. Inside the manor, Hermione looked up from her book. Harry came in and sat across from her, and they looked at each other for a moment in the particular way of people who have known each other long enough that a look is sufficient. She put a bookmark in her page. They went to work. The balance held. "Let us know what you'd like to see next." The end.